Test, test. Did you hear it? Yeah. Okay. Hello? Okay. All right. Well, I think this is on. Okay. All right. Well, listen, we appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗠𝗣, and I'm the director of Ratio Christi. We're the student apologetics ministry here that is hosting this event. And, you know, we've had several events at Ohio State through the years. I'm sorry, the Ohio State University through the years. So we're so pleased to, of course, have Dr. Frank Turek back. He's no stranger here. He's been here a number of times. And this is our first event post-COVID, we might say. So we're excited you guys came out tonight. So it's good. It's just good to be back, and appreciate you coming out to the Fawcett Center. I know this is a new location, but we couldn't find anything at Ohio Union this time, but thanks for coming. So, having said that, there's some info about our ministry outside at the table out there. We will be selling more of Dr. Turek's materials after the event towards the Q&A period. Now, during the Q&A period, just come up right there. The microphone will be there. I'll put this back here, and you can ask Dr. Turek a question. Obviously, try to keep it to one question per person. It helps. So, but anyway, why don't we give a warm welcome to Dr. Frank Turek.
Well, good evening, Buckeyes. Let's go back to September 29th, 2006. That's when Petty Officer Michael Mansour is United States Navy SEAL operating in Ramadi, Iraq. Mansour is standing on a roof in Ramadi, and he's standing in front of a doorway to this roof. And he has feedback. And he has two Navy SEAL. Hey, Kyle, maybe you could cut off that mic. That might be it. I don't know. Anyway, Mansour has two Navy SEAL teammates lying in the sniper-prone position next to him. They've already taken AK-47 fire and a rocket-propelled grenade, but they're not exactly sure where the enemy is. There's a bit of a lull in the fighting. Insurgents have blocked off the streets in Ramadi, and there's someone on the loudspeaker in the town mosque yelling, "Kill the Americans!" As Mansour and his team are looking for the next attack, an insurgent from an unknown location throws a grenade up on the roof. It hits Mansour in the chest, and it falls to his feet. Due to the length of the throw, there's no opportunity to pick it up and throw it back. Mansour has only a split second to make a decision. He can leap through the doorway behind him and save himself, but if he does, his two teammates lying on the roof will surely die. Mansour yells, "Grenade!" But instead of jumping backward to save himself, he jumps forward, chest first, onto the grenade. It detonates. 30 minutes later, 25-year-old Michael Mansour is dead. His two teammates lying on the roof receive only minor injuries because Mansour's body muffled the blast. One of them said at Mansour's funeral, "Mikey looked death in the face that day and said, 'You will not take my friends, and I will go in their stead.'" I've never seen a United States president cry until April of 2008. That's when President George W. Bush invited Mansour's parents into the East Room of the White House to give them their son's Medal of Honor posthumously. The president couldn't even get through the citation without breaking down. Since then, Mansour's High School in Garden Grove, California, built a new stadium. They named it Michael A. Mansour Memorial Stadium. The golden trident insignia that the SEALs wear dominates the 50-yard line. January 2019, North Island, California, just outside of San Diego, the United States Navy commissioned the USS Michael Mansour, the newest guided missile destroyer in the fleet. This is Mansour's mother, Sally, being escorted onto the ship named in honor of her fallen son. Now, why did they do this? Because Michael Mansour literally sacrificed himself to save his friends. There's no greater love than to sacrifice yourself to save your friends, said Jesus of Nazareth before he went to the cross. Michael Mansour sacrificed himself to save his friends. The question is, would anybody sacrifice himself to save you? And the answer is, someone already has. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. But in today's culture, many people don't think the story's true. They think it's invented. After all, it was written down by religious people. Don't religious people tend to embellish things? And by the way, it's got miracles in it. We don't believe in miracles anymore. We're in the scientific age. We are the Ohio State University, right? We don't believe in miracles anymore. Well, I actually think it's quite easy to show that Christianity is true. You only need to answer 4 questions in the affirmative to show that it's true. In other words, if you investigate these 4 questions, I think you'll realize that the answer to these 4 questions is yes. And if the answer to these 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4. Pretty grooving music, isn't it? Yeah. That's actually from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday night. I know some of you say you watch the show, you and my mom. That's good. It's on the NRB network, which means it's on Roku on NRB. It's also on DirecTV channel 378. It's also on the internet, streaming on our website. We also are on radio every Saturday mornings. I know there's one of the stations around here somewhere. It's below, say, 92 FM. It's an AFR station. What is it? 88.1. This young lady here says 88.1. But if you're a college student, I know you don't get up until the crack of noon on Saturday. So this is podcasted. You can listen to it anytime you want. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. What we do is we present evidence for Christianity. We cross-examine ideas against it based on our website right here, crossexamine.org. Now, why are these the 4 questions? Truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament. And this is going to serve as our outline here tonight, okay? First question, does truth exist? Why is that important? Because a lot of people say there's no truth. You got your truth, I got my truth, or all truth is relative, right? You've heard these claims. If there's no truth, quite obviously Christianity can't be true. Of course, if there's no truth, atheism can't be true either. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if truth didn't exist, would you be paying $40,000 or $50,000 to go to the Ohio State University? I mean, aren't you here to learn truth? Isn't that the whole point? Of course there's truth. We'll talk about it. Second question, does God exist? Obviously, Christianity can't be true if there's no God. I hope to show you tonight that a theistic God really does exist. What's a theistic God? That's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created all things and sustains all things to this very moment. We're going to look at 3 arguments for this being. These arguments are in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. In fact, we're going to try and establish point 2 without any reference to any religious writing. And we're going to spend a majority of our time actually in point 2. Third question, are miracles possible? Obviously, Christianity can't be true if miracles are not possible. But I hope to show you tonight that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible has already occurred, and even atheists are admitting the data for this miracle. We'll see that tonight. Then we're going to get to the key question, is the New Testament true? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer if there's no truth, no God, or no miracles. But if truth exists, if God exists, if miracles are possible, then we want to see if the data from the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know if one particular event from the ancient world took place. What would that event be? The resurrection, right? Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity's true. Of course, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, game over, it's false. You might as well sleep in on Sunday and do what you want the rest of the week, because if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, if you're a Christian, your faith is in vain. Even their greatest apostle, Paul, said, your faith's in vain if he hasn't risen from the dead. In other words, Christianity is a religious worldview that you can test through evidence and see if it's true or not. So that's what we hope to do tonight. All right? Now, we can't cover all this material in any great detail tonight. We're going to skim over the surface of a lot of it, so if you want to go further, we do have a few copies of the book available on the book table. There's a 12-part DVD series that some of you I know are using in small groups and Sunday schools and that kind of thing. And there's a newer book out there called Stealing from God. Now, if you're a Christian in here, this book, Stealing from God, is not about tithing, okay? The subtitle is Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. I've noticed that when atheists are arguing there is no God, they actually have to steal aspects of reality that would only exist if God existed in order to say he doesn't exist. In effect, they have to sit in God's lap to slap his face. Now, I want to point out that all the proceeds from the sale of the books and the DVDs will go to feed needy children. Mine. Okay? Just so you know. I got 3 sons, so I need some help. Actually, you don't have to buy a book, obviously, because I want to send you the entire PowerPoint presentation, even the slides I can't show you due to time. All you need to do is text the word evidence to this phone number, 855-909-0582. That goes for the people watching on the internet, too. 855-909-0582. Just text that word evidence, and we will send you the entire PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format so you can watch it at your leisure or look at it at your leisure, all right? So that's kind of the big picture. We've got to start right here, though, at point 1. Does truth exist? Now, before we do that, I do want to point out that later we're going to do Q&A. Actually, maybe tonight, I don't think we'll do Q&A. I think we'll do all Q, no A, all right? So everyone can ask a question, takes all the pressure off me, right? Okay? No, but we'll have the microphone set up for that later. But we got to start right here at point 1. Does truth exist? Are you guys ready to go? Yes. All right. Now, whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand, and he said to him, "Colonel, I want the truth." And Nicholson said, "You can't handle the truth." Buckeyes. If he said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere, okay? The Wolverines were better at this. I'm just letting you know. He didn't say, "You can't handle the truth." That's not how he said it. Here's how he said it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try it again. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. You blew away the Wolverines. Now, didn't that feel good? Didn't you just want to come into some religious event and yell at the guy on stage, "You can't handle the truth"? Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. They're saying, "You got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative." Well, if you don't get anything else out of what we talk about here tonight, this is going to be the most important thinking skill we're going to talk about. And to show you what a dimwit I was 33 years old. I already had a master's degree, and I did not know what I'm about to show you right here, right now. And it's so simple. Once you get your mind around this thinking skill, whether you're an atheist, a Christian, anywhere in between, it's going to be helpful. Why? Because this thinking skill will help you discover what is false. And why is it important to discover what is false? 2 reasons. Number 1, if you can dispense with what is false, then you can spend more time looking at truth, right? And secondly, if you start living by false principles, ultimately you're going to slap up against reality, and it's going to hurt. So this can save you a lot of pain and suffering, this thinking skill. So the best way of showing you this thinking skill is to give you an example of using it. So suppose someone were to come up to you and say, "There is no truth." You should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Is that true? Hey, this is a sophisticated crowd, right? Somebody says there's no truth, you're going to say, "Hey, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth?" Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? Can everybody see that this is a self-defeating statement? What's a self-defeating statement? A self-defeating statement violates one of the fundamental laws of all logic, the law of non-contradiction. A self-defeating statement doesn't meet its own standard. This statement doesn't meet its own standard because it claims it's true that there's no truth. If it's true, it's false. You get it? It would be like if I said I can't speak a word in English. What would you say? No, you're using English to say it, right? Now, here's the thinking skill. If you get used to this, regardless of what you believe about religion or God or any of this, if you get used to this, it's going to be helpful. What you want to do is you want to turn the claim on itself. Turn the claim on itself. So somebody says there is no truth. You turn the claim on itself and you say, "Is that true?" And you're asking a question. You're not even making a statement, right? All right, let's do a few more of these. Suppose someone says, "All truth is relative." If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Is that a relative truth? No, you see, this is an absolute truth claim claiming all truth is relative. This is a self-defeating statement. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Now, Rarely do people come out and say there's no truth. They don't even say this very often anymore, right? They don't say, well, all truth is relative. They're a little bit smarter than that now, but you will hear things like this. Sometimes the same thing is said this way. There isn't the truth, only my truth, right? I've got my truth. You've got your truth. There is no the truth. You live your truth. I live my truth. That just sounds so great, doesn't it? It's so Oprah, isn't it? It makes so much sense, doesn't it? It seems like it does until you ask one question. If someone were to say this to you, there isn't the truth, only my truth, you simply ask them, is that just your truth or the truth? You see, because if this statement is just your truth, well, why should I believe it then, right? It's just your opinion. But if this statement is the truth, you just got done telling me there isn't any the truth. This is a self-defeating statement. I know this is going to sound upsetting for some because in our culture, people really like to buy into the your truth, my truth thing. But in reality, there's no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just the truth. To say you have your own truth, you might as well say I have my own math. I mean, suppose you hire me to do a job and you say, Frank, I'll pay you $10 an hour. And it takes me 15 hours. And I come up to you and I say, great, you owe me $15,000. And you go, whoa, hold on, I owe you 150, not 15,000. And I go, oh, no, I have my own math. You owe me 15,000. You're going to go, you're nuts. It doesn't work that way. Look, there's only the truth, not your truth, not my truth. Now, sometimes it isn't said this way. Sometimes it's said this way. It's true for you, but not for me. Well, Christianity may be true for you, but Buddhism's true for me. What do you say to that? This is also self-defeating. It's just a little bit more subtle. If you turn the claim on itself, you should ask this question. If they say it's true for you, but not for me, say, hey, is that true for everybody? Is true for you, but not for me, true for everybody? Because if true for you, but not for me is true for everybody, then true for you, but not for me can't be true because it's true for everybody. Did I say that right? I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because it's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Actually, there's a more fun way of dealing with this. If somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, say, sure, go try that with your bank teller. Yeah, go to your bank teller one day and say, I'd like $100,000 out of my account. Bank teller looks at your account and says, I'm sorry, I only have $6.12 in your account. It's easy to get the money. You simply say, ha, that's true for you, but not for me. Give me the 100 grand. Are you going to get the money? No, if it's true there was only $6.12 in your account, that's true for all people at all times in all places when referring to your account at that time. It's just true. Can't change it. It is what it is. It's not your truth or my truth. It just happens to be the truth. By the way, I go to a lot of churches. I normally ask people, do you think Christianity is true? And most people will say yes, and then I'll ask them why. And they say, because I have faith. Is that a good answer? Does your faith change whether or not God exists or Jesus rose from the dead? I mean, do you have to believe something to make it true? Do you have to believe in gravity to stay on the ground? Do people who don't believe in gravity float away? Hey, look, there's another one. Hey, if you believe, you'll come back. No, that's not the way it works. You say, why is the Bible always talking about faith then? Because there's two kinds of faith, and this is a very important distinction. There's belief that, and then there's belief in. Belief that is getting evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the documents are reliable. That's what we call apologetics. Doesn't mean you're saying you're sorry. It means you're giving evidence for what you believe. But all the belief that in the world won't get your moral transgressions forgiven. For that, you got to go from belief that to belief in or trust in. There's a difference. James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called? James. You guys are sharp tonight. The Wolverines didn't get that. All right? James says, even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. Do you know that if God exists and demons exist, and they do you know that demons know that God exists better than we do? I mean, they're in the spiritual realm. They know that He exists, but they don't trust in Him. See, there's a difference. Belief that is just intellectual. Belief in is not only intellectual, it's also volitional. It's also of the heart. And we know this in relationships, don't we? When I first met my wife almost 37 years ago, I got evidence that she would be a good wife, but all the evidence in the world didn't make her my wife. I had to take a step of trust in her to ask her to be my wife. And in a momentary lapse of judgment, she said yes. That's the difference between belief that and belief in. Now, most of the time when the Bible's talking about faith, it's talking about the second kind, belief in. After you know that Jesus has risen from the dead, trust in him. In fact, the word we ought to be using is trust. That's what it literally means in the Greek. It means to trust. After you know that it's true, trust in him. The idea that faith is a lack of belief, or a faith is you don't have any evidence for it, that's not the definition of faith. The definition of faith is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe is true. Trusting in what you have good evidence to believe is true. How about this? You probably hear this, especially at the university. You'll hear this quite a bit. There's no truth in anything but science. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Simply ask, hey, is that a scientific truth? Can you go in the laboratory and prove this? No, this is a philosophical claim. You can't prove that in the laboratory. That's philosophy. That's a statement about science. In fact, in the book Stealing from God out there, we have a chapter on science, and the title of the chapter is this: Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Science doesn't say a word. Why am I saying that? Because all data needs to be gathered, and all data needs to be interpreted, and who does that? Scientists do that. Science doesn't do a thing. In fact, you ever wonder why you get conflicting advice on COVID? Why is that? Well, sometimes they gather good data and they interpret it properly so you get good advice. Sometimes they gather good data, but they interpret it poorly, so you get bad advice. Sometimes they got bad data. Doesn't matter how they interpret it, you're going to get bad advice. Sometimes there's a political agenda. No. Are you kidding me? By the way, why do we think that scientists are somehow free from the big three temptations the rest of us are susceptible to? What are the big three temptations we all have? Sex, money, and power. Those are the same three things that affect everybody, whether you're a scientist or not. Unfortunately, it seems like so much of science has become politicized. And a lot of times I don't know what to believe. Are you the same way? I just don't know. I don't have the expertise for I don't know what's right anymore. I'm hearing so much conflicting evidence, and people say, follow the science. I go, which science? Science doesn't say a word. And by the way, you can't do science without philosophy. Science is built on philosophy, which is how to gather the data, how to interpret it. That takes your mind to do that. That's philosophy. In fact, when you get a PhD, what does the PH stand for? Philosophy. In fact, you can't understand the Bible without philosophy. You can't understand the newspaper. Oh, you don't know what a newspaper is. You can't understand the internet without philosophy. Right thinking about reality. How about this? You probably hear this a lot. You should doubt everything. Yeah, say, hey, should I doubt that? By the way, one other thing about science, which is important. We all know science is important. It's made us very comfortable. But the most important things in life have nothing to do with science. Honey, do you love me? Yeah. Why? I don't know. Let's run some kind of experiment. Right? No. Anyway, why are skeptics skeptical of everything but skepticism? You ever notice that? Now, by the way, how many people in here, whether you're Christian, atheist, anywhere in between, how many people in here sometimes doubt that what you believe about these things is true? Look, if you don't have your hand up right now, you're probably not thinking very much. Look, I've written books on this stuff, and sometimes I wake up and I go, I don't even know if this is true. You ever do that? But then I start thinking about my doubts, and I realize most of my doubts are emotional. They're not intellectual. In other words, I look at the evidence, I go, the evidence is really good for this. But if I'm having a good day, everything's fine. Bad day, don't know. Good day, fine. Bad day, don't know. Good day, fine. Bad day, don't know. What's changing, me or the evidence? Me, I'm going up and down. The evidence doesn't change at all. In fact, sometimes when I meet former Christians, they say, Frank, you know, I used to be a Christian, but I lost my faith. No, I don't mean to be unkind, but since I'm originally from New Jersey, sometimes I am. So when they say I lost my faith, you know what I want to say to them? So? So, are you telling me because your psychology has changed that God has somehow popped out of existence? Are you telling me that because your psychology changed, Jesus didn't rise from the dead? Do you know that your psychology will not tell you a thing about anything outside your skull? The evidence will. Don't let your psychology dictate what you believe. Let me give you an example of this. Some of us are afraid to fly. Thankfully, I'm not. That's why I can do these things. But some of us are afraid to get on an airplane. Psychologically, we can't handle it. Yet when we look at the evidence, it's safer to fly from this side of the room to that side of the room than it is to walk there, right? It's the safest way to get anywhere. We ignore the evidence on account of our psychology. Don't let that be you when it comes to eternal things. Don't let your psychology dictate what you think about things outside your skull. Let the evidence tell you how you ought to believe. And I think if you do that, you'll realize that your doubts are emotional, they're not intellectual. And if you start doubting your doubts, then you're back to knowing something for sure. Have you guys thought about doubting your doubts? I doubt it. How about this one? You hear this a lot. You ought not judge. Jesus said, don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrites? All right, let's leave Jesus out for just a second. Logically, what's the problem with the claim? Yeah, if somebody says you ought not judge, you ought to say, hey, isn't that a judgment? Or you can say, if we're not to judge, why are you judging me for judging? See, it's a judgment. You say, wait a minute, Frank, didn't Jesus say don't judge? Nope, never said it. Sure he did. He said it in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. It's right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. All right, I know this is going to sound weird, but it's true. There are no verses in the Bible. There are no verses in the Bible. You think when Matthew was writing his biography, which we call a gospel, he said, okay, here's chapter 7, verse 1. No. When were the chapter and verse divisions put in? About 500 years ago to help us navigate the text. Why? Because it's a really long series of books. It'd be really hard to find your way around without numbers. I mean, imagine you had a Bible without numbers, and your pastor got up there one Sunday morning and said, let's go about 2/3 of the way in. Let's see if we can find the same spot. Right? No, it's not going to work. You need numbers. The problem is we tend to think if it's got a number in front of it, we can take it out and make it say whatever we want. That's not legitimate. In fact, you've got to read around the passage to see what's going on. Jesus doesn't stop after he says, judge not. What does he say right after that? Judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite, which is a judgment, take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It's actually a command on how to judge. In other words, you got this problem, fix it, then go help your brother. But it would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Number one, it's a judgment itself. Number two, you'd be dead already if you didn't make judgments. You made 100 judgments just this evening getting over here. Right? Good choices from bad choices. Safe choices from dangerous choices. And now you're going, was it a good judgment to come here? This guy's kind of crazy. Right? Everybody's making judgments. Atheists make judgments. Atheists judge there's no God. They judge Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Bible's not telling the truth. There is no objective moral standard. There's no meaning to life. When you die, you're going to become worm food. It's hopeless. Have a nice day. These are all judgments. The only question is, are your judgments true? I will say this, though. Jesus did save a very stern rebuke for people who were judgmental. And who were the judgmental ones in his day? Pharisees, right? Who were the Pharisees? They were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Many of them were on the Sanhedrin. That's the Jewish Supreme Court, their political body to whom Rome delegated much of the day-to-day legal authority to. They were the politicians of Jerusalem, of Israel. And Jesus went after these people. Are you telling me Jesus got involved in politics? Yes! And he wasn't so nice doing it. In fact, if you think Jesus was a sweet guy who's never said a bad word about anyone, you have not read John chapter 2, John chapter 8, or Matthew chapter 23. What happens in John chapter 2? Jesus makes a whip and he goes and he jacks people up in the temple. Sweet and gentle Jesus did this? Yes! And then in John chapter 8, he's talking to these religious politicians, the Pharisees. He's having a bit of an argument with them. And he's right in the middle of the argument, and he says, your father is the devil. Jesus, you can't say that. That's not very Christ-like. Excuse me, I am Christ? Can you imagine you're having an argument with somebody and you say, your father is the devil? Never try that with a sibling. Okay? And then in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus again is going after these religious politicians. And he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Oh, you look great on the outside. You're whitewashed tombs. But on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. You go a mile to make a convert, and then once you make them a convert, you make them twice as much a son of hell as you are. How will you avoid being condemned to hell? What? Sweet and gentle Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney. He was not Mr. Rogers. Can you say kindness, boys and girls? Look, he was kind most of the time, but he certainly didn't go around saying, this sermon brought to you by the letter E. No, Jesus was tough. Don't buy into the idea that Jesus was some kind of 60s flower child, for those who are old enough to know what that is. Jesus was tough. In fact, why did they kill him? Number one, he claimed to be God, which was blasphemy to the Jews and sedition to the Romans. And number two, he spoke truth to power, particularly the temple authorities, who knew that if Jesus succeeded, they were out of a job. In fact, Caiaphas, the high priest, knew Jesus was the Messiah, I think. He knew Jesus had resurrected Lazarus from the dead. What does he say about this? In the very next chapter, John 12, right after the Lazarus event occurs, the miracle occurs, Caiaphas says, it's better that one innocent man die than the whole nation perish. He had evidence that Jesus was the Messiah, but his power got in the way of him accepting it. Sex, money, power. By the way, I've noticed one other thing about judging. You ever notice when you compliment somebody, which is a judgment, nobody gets upset? You know, if you say to your best friend, I really love you. You're such a wonderful person. I wish I could be like you. You think your friend's going to say, well, just who are you to judge? Who do you think you are? No, nobody's ever going to say that, right? I've noticed that people don't really have a problem with judging. They just have a problem with judgments they don't like. In fact, if you tell somebody something that's true and they get all mad at you, you just helped convict them. As Augustine said, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. A few military people in here. And by the way, I was in the Navy for 8 years, which stands for never again volunteer yourself. But for you military people in here, you always get more flack when you're over the target. If you tell somebody something that's true and they're shooting back at you, you're over the target. They don't want their evil deeds exposed. As Jesus said, men love darkness rather than light. We don't want people to tell us the truth because we want to stay in darkness so we could do what we want to do. Now, there's a lot more we could talk about with these self-defeating statements. We don't have time. We've got to move on. But I just want to summarize this whole section this way. Can everybody see that this statement right here shoots itself? Yes. Can everybody see that? And all the other statements we just went through, they all shoot themselves. Okay? Which means if our reasoning is good here, that relativism and postmodernism are false. Why? Because they claim it's true that there's no truth, which is self-defeating, okay? You can't get away from truth. Well, actually, you can get away from it temporarily. What do? You suppress it. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1, that we suppress the truth and unrighteousness to go our own way. In fact, later during the Q&A, first of all, if you're an atheist or a non-Christian, thank you for coming. But I might ask you a question if you come up to the Q&A mic, and it's not fair for me to do that unless I warn you in advance what the question is. So I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to tell you the question I might ask you. Here's the question. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists stand in front of that microphone in front of hundreds of people. I ask that question, and they say, no. I say, no? How's that reasonable? How's that rational? It's not. The problem isn't here. The problem's here. They don't want it to be true. They don't want Christianity to be true. They're not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God of their own lives. They don't want an authority over them. Now, I'm not saying this is true of all atheists. I'm saying these are the people that say no. If it were true, I wouldn't believe it. Now, you can make yourself happy over the short term doing a lot of fun things, but over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone in this room, the few of us in here who are over 40 know what I'm talking about, because many of us have tried it ourselves. The only way to get true contentment and happiness is to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. So always ask the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? If the person hesitates or says no, the problem's not here, the problem's here. Now, a lot of people don't want to be a Christian because they've been hurt in the church. I get that. But let me ask you a question. If somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Beethoven, right? If somebody plays Christ poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Christ. You blame the Christian, the so-called Christian. Well, newsflash, Christians are not Christianity. Jesus is Christianity. Okay? So, yes, Christians should act better, but sometimes we don't. We're fallen human beings just like everybody else. Put your eyes on Jesus. He's still true and beautiful even when we don't play him truly or beautifully. So, truth does exist. The next question, is it true that God exists? And I mentioned there are three arguments for the existence of a theistic God that we're going to look at. Let's start right here. The first is from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. Now, cosmological comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe. And it says if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design, known as the teleological argument. Telos is a Greek word meaning design or purpose. And it says if there's design in the universe and design in life, there must be a designer. Now, these two arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. We'll see a little bit of that. The third argument doesn't have any science behind it. It's more philosophical in nature, yet it's the argument we've all known since we were very small children. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says that there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one. Like it's wrong to torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to murder 6 million people in a Holocaust, or if it's wrong to invade another country without provocation, like Putin's doing right now, then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond us, everything's just a matter of opinion. Now, we know certain things are right and other things are wrong. If that's the case, there must be a standard beyond us, that standard of righteousness that we're obligated to obey. If that standard doesn't exist, which is God's nature, you can't say anything's really right or wrong. It's just your opinion. Now, we're going to go through these arguments, and I want to point out that what we're arguing here is if someone ever asks you, how do you know God exists? Here's what you ought to say. I know God by his effects. In other words, this is what scientists do. They have an effect, they're trying to figure out what the cause is. Okay? So if a universe is an effect, the cause, if there's a creation, the cause must be a creator. If design is the effect, the cause of the design is the designer. If there's a moral law written on your heart, which is the effect, there must be a cause known as the moral lawgiver. If you have the ability to think and reason, that's the effect, there must be a cause, a mind. So you're reasoning from effect back to cause. And so we're going to look at a bunch of effects now in order to try and discover what the cause is. We'll get to these arguments later, these bottom two, but let's start right here at the cosmological argument. Now, you got to admit, it was worth coming out here to the Ohio State University just to see God do that. Right? Did you see that? Now, some of you said, I've never seen God move. Oh, really? Check this out. Look at that. Now, this is the argument that many say points back to the big... Now, I know there's some Christians in here going, Frank, you know, we're Christians in here, and we don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang is so good that even atheistic physicists like Stephen Hawking, who died about 5 years ago, he was probably the top physicist, at least most well-known physicist in the world. He was an atheist, but here's what he said about the beginning. He said, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. That space, time, and matter literally had a beginning out of nothing. What is nothing? It wasn't a quantum vacuum. It wasn't swirling mathematical points. Nothing is non-being. Aristotle had a good definition of nothing. He said, nothing is what rocks dream about. It's nothing, all right? Now, Hawking tried to come up with another explanation other than God. He failed, but he's admitting the data. Alexander Vilenkin, a Russian cosmologist who believes in the multiverse, even, you probably heard of the multiverse, right? He says, look, even if the multiverse is true, the whole show has to have an absolute beginning. In fact, here's what he said in his book. He's an agnostic. He said this, with the proof now in place, cosmologists, by the way, a cosmologist is not someone that puts on your makeup, all right? A cosmologist is someone that studies the universe. Cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Two interesting words in this quote. First word, proof. Unusual for scientists to use the word proof. Why? Because science is tentative. Scientific theories get overturned continually. They thought it was the truth, and now it isn't. But Vilenkin sees so many lines of evidence pointing back to a beginning that he calls it a proof. The other interesting word is the word problem. Why is it a problem that there's a cosmic beginning? Because if all of nature had a beginning, whatever created nature can't be made of nature. It must be something beyond nature. Something we might call super nature, beyond the natural. Now, Vilenkin's an agnostic on this, but he's admitting the data. Now, we're not going to look at the evidence for this. Why? Number one, it's all in the book, chapter 3. Number two, we don't have time. Number three, it's not controversial. Most scientists are admitting, and philosophers are admitting, because there's evidence from philosophy the universe had a beginning. If that's the case, whatever created it, it seems, is the question. That's what people are arguing over. What created the universe? Not did the universe have a beginning. So let's just jump to the bottom line. Here's the bottom line. If the universe had a beginning, it seems it must have had a beginner. We've got two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. At least it's supposed to advance. Stand by. There you go. It came up. Someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, here's my only question. Which view is more reasonable? That no one created something out of nothing, or that someone created something out of nothing? What do you think? Someone. I was at Texas A&M a number of years ago. I put this slide up, and an atheist said, oh, I think number one is more reasonable. I said, number one, time out. Let's look at number two. Number two says someone created something out of nothing. Now, that's a miracle, right? But at least you got a miracle worker. You got someone. Number one is a miracle with no miracle worker. That's clearly absurd. In fact, I said to the audience at A&M that night, I said, to show you how seriously we all take the law of causality. Oh, by the way, law of causality doesn't say everything has a cause. The law of causality says everything that comes to be has a cause. There has to be an uncaused first cause. A being whose existence equals its essence. A being who has always existed. What Aristotle might call the unmoved mover. Either it's the universe or something outside the universe. So I said to the audience that night, I said, to show you how seriously we all take the law of causality, that everything that comes to be has a cause. There is nobody sitting here in this auditorium tonight who is currently worried that as you sit here, a hippopotamus has appeared out of nothing, by nothing, in your dorm room and is currently pooping on your pillow. Right? You don't worry about that. You're not worried that a raging Bengal tiger is just going to appear out of nothing right here in this auditorium right now and start devouring people, right? You don't worry that things don't pop into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause. You don't think they're going to do that. And if the whole universe can do so, then why doesn't everything do so? Why don't Teslas pop into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause? You wake up one morning, you look outside, your Hyundai is a Tesla. And you go, how do I charge this thing? Right? Why don't MacBook Pros pop into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause? Could have saved me $4 grand. If you're hungry after this and you want to have a pizza, does it make sense to order one? Or should you just sit in your dorm room, wait, and hope one pops into existence out of nothing, by nothing, without a cause? No, it seems to me the atheists have all the faith. By the way, do you notice that everybody believes in at least one miracle? Christians believe in more than one. We certainly believe in this miracle, that someone created something out of nothing. But atheists, many of them believe that no one created something out of nothing. Which takes more faith? Everyone believes in at least one miracle. In fact, here's a question to ask an atheist. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? I mean, if there is no God, why does anything exist? Think about that. Why does anything exist if there's no God? It seems the universe had a beginning. Now think about this, ladies and gentlemen. If space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing, and that's what the evidence seems to show, then whatever created space, matter, and time can't be made of space, matter, and time. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, because to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, someone had to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. Also, the being would have to be intelligent to have a mind to make a choice. Now, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? God. You say, Frank, how do you know it's the Christian God? We don't. Yet, this could be Allah, or a deistic God even. This argument doesn't get you all the way to Christianity. It could be the Christian God, but we don't know if it's the Christian God. You get 6 attributes from one argument. If you keep going through these questions and you discover that Jesus really rose from the dead, then you can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,989 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. But we haven't gotten there yet. We have a being that could be the God of the Bible, but we don't know if it is. So we got to keep looking at other arguments. The next argument is the argument from design, known as the teleological argument. There are 2 aspects to this. One argument is the argument from the design in the universe. That's an effect. The other argument is the design in life. That's also an effect. So you're trying to reason back to a cause. So let's look at the universe first. Scientists have discovered in recent decades that the universe is fine-tuned. What does that mean? That if you were to change any one of a number of factors about our universe virtually imperceptibly, there would either be no universe or certainly no universe that could support life. And there are scores of these kinds of constants, well, at least a dozen or more, depending upon how you look at them. In fact, let me just give you one of them from Stephen Hawking, again an atheist, who put it this way. He said if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million million a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies. In other words, if the expansion rate from the very beginning was that infinitesimally different, none of us would be here. Now, you can't make any sort of evolutionary explanation for this. You can't say, well, maybe it evolved this expansion rate to a certain point by chance, whatever that means. Why? Because this is one of the initial conditions of the universe. It started there, right where it needed to be, the expansion rate, that is. Seems to me the same being that created space, matter, and time is the same being that fine-tuned the expansion rate to be precisely what it needed to be here for us to even exist. Also, the gravitational force, if it were altered by more than 1 part in 10 to the 40th power compared to the strong nuclear force, we wouldn't exist. What's 1 part in 10 to the 40th power? That's 1 part in 1 with 40 zeros following it. You say, Frank, I can't get my head around that number. I know, neither can I. Let me give an illustration. Stack dimes on the North American continent all the way to the moon. And then do that more than 1 billion other times on the North American continents. Mark 1 red dime, mix it in, you know, up to the moon's over 200,000 miles, I think, right? Mix it in on over 1 billion North American continents up to the moon, blindfold somebody, throw him in all those dimes, and have him pick one by chance. The chance that he would pick the 1 red dime is 1 in 10 to the 40th power. Now, there's only 2 explanations for that value being where it is right now. Either it was designed to be there or it wasn't. What makes more sense? It was designed. There's 0 chance it happened by the way, what does chance mean? Does chance cause things? Is chance a cause? Who caused this? Chance, he was just here. No. Chance is not a cause. You know what chance really is? Chance is a word we use to describe mathematical possibilities. Chance is not a cause. When scientists say, well, it happened by chance, you know what they really mean? We don't know. Look, you have to have a lot of faith to believe this happened without intelligence, without design. Now, it's not just, there's at least a dozen more of these we could go through. We don't have time. But it's not only the universe is fine-tuned, our solar system appears to be designed with us in mind. So let's look at the solar system. Yeah, stay awake. Stay awake. Here we are, third rock from the sun. If we were just a little bit closer to or a little bit further away, we couldn't survive. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It is. That's a lie. It's too cold here in the winter. Earth rotation, 24 hours. Change that slightly, we don't exist. The size and distance of the moon from us. Change that slightly, we don't exist. The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees. Change that slightly, we don't exist. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we couldn't exist here on Earth. Why? What does Jupiter do for us? Its gravitational force is so strong that it attracts most of the meteors and space junk to it rather than us. Jupiter is a cosmic vacuum cleaner. In fact, if you take a close-up look at Jupiter, you see these dark marks? Those dark marks are comet fragment strikes that are bigger than the Earth. Thank God for Jupiter. In fact, if Jupiter wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. Saturn does the same thing, by the way. In fact, you want to look at our solar system? Here it is. There's Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Earth. Look at poor Pluto down here. You know, Pluto recently has been demoted as a planet. I don't know about you, but I think it's size discrimination. And what if Pluto identifies as a planet? What then? You bigots. Take a look at this. You can hardly see Pluto. Take a look at this. That's Arcturus. That's another star in our galaxy. Here's the sun over here. Jupiter is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Earth is invisible. Pluto, forget about it. All right, keep an eye on Arcturus now. Where's Arcturus now? Way over here. See it? Here's Antares. It's another star in our galaxy. These are all in our galaxy, not outside our galaxy. Here's the sun. The sun is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Jupiter is invisible. Earth, Pluto, forget about them. In fact, if the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse here. Look, I don't name the stars, okay? If the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse would be 5 or 6 Empire State Buildings high. The heavens are awesome. And that's just in our galaxy. That's not outside our galaxy. And the average distance between stars in our galaxy is 30 trillion miles, and all that distance is necessary for us to exist here on Earth. Now, 30 trillion miles, how far is that? Far. It'll take at least 2 tanks of gas and a Toyota Prius to go 30 trillion miles. A number of years ago, my wife and I took our sons to the Desert Museum in Tucson, Arizona. If you ever get a chance to go to Tucson, other side of the mountains south of the city, if you go out there at night, on a clear night, you can see thousands of stars in the sky. So it was so clear this night, the guide said, if we look up at 9:03, we will see the space shuttle in orbit. He said, oh, come on. We're not going to see the space shuttle. It's only 120 feet long. It's 350 miles up. We're not going to see it. Oh, me of little faith. At 9:03, the guide goes, look! And we look up in the sky. There's an object streaking out of the western desert sky, relative to us, about like this. I mean, it's really cooking. When it got right about here, it disappeared. I don't know whether Scotty beamed it up or what. Actually, what happened was, despite the fact that we were in total darkness, the space shuttle was so high up that the sun was still reflecting off of it, And when it got out of the range of the sun, we couldn't see it anymore. Now, when the space shuttle was in orbit, the space shuttle was traveling at about 18,000 miles an hour. That's 5 miles per second. You got trouble getting to school in the morning? Take the space shuttle. You'll be here. 5 miles a second. Think about how fast that is. Well, I did a little calculation to try and figure out how long would it take us if we could get in the space shuttle and go from our star, the sun, to another star in our galaxy an average distance away 30 trillion miles. In other words, how long would it take us to go 30 trillion miles if we could go 5 miles per second? How long do you think it would take us? Long time. Used to be a math major. It would take us 201,450 years. That means if you got in the space shuttle at the time of Christ and started traveling from our star, the sun, to another star inside our galaxy an average distance away, you've been going 5 miles a second for 2,000 years. You would be less than 1/100th of the way there right now. And we're going to explore space. We're not going anywhere in space. We can hardly get out of our solar system. It took us 9 years to get to Pluto. We're never going to get to another planetary system. It's too far and it's too dangerous. But let's suppose we figure out light speed travel and we do get to another planetary system. In fact, what I'm about to show you now is a little bit disturbing, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. Suppose we get to another planetary system, we plant our flag, and then this happens. Neat sound, Kyle. Have him turn up the sound. Are not for astronauts, ladies and gentlemen. To show you how analytical my wife is, I showed her that video, and she smiled just a little bit, and then she said, "That's illogical. There's no sound in space." You got it, didn't you? You must be homeschooled. See? Right? Exactly. Here's what the psalmist said, "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him." How high are the heavens above the earth? Well, the Hubble Space Telescope helped us discover that. A number of years ago, they trained the Hubble Space Telescope on 1/26 millionth of the sky. What's 1/26 millionth of the sky? Go out tonight, put a piece of rice on the end of your finger, hold it up at arm's length. That piece of rice represents about 1/26 millionth of the sky. And Hubble trained, or they trained the Hubble telescope on that spot for 11 days total exposure time. I'm going to show you what they found. I don't know if you can see this, but along the bottom here, you see these are mountains. This is the southern hemisphere. I'm going to start the little composite video they put together to show you what they found in 1/26 millionth of the sky. You'll see the constellations come up, and then Hubble is going to zoom in, or out, however you look at it, at 1/26 millionth of the sky. There is no audio, it's just video. This is in the public domain. You can Google this and see it. It's called Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Are you ready? Here we go. Let's see what Hubble found. There are the constellations. Now let's see what's out there. What you're looking at are nearly 10,000 galaxies, each with billions of stars themselves, in 1/26 millionth of the sky. Now, how many stars are out there? Researchers at the University of Hawaii tried to figure it out. How many stars are there in the entire universe? If you can find 10,000 galaxies in 1/26 millionth of the sky, how many stars are there in the entire universe? The number of stars in the entire universe are about equivalent to the number of grains of sand on all the beaches on all the earth times 100,000. And to go from one star to another star, just in our galaxy, going 5 miles a second, will take you over 200,000 years. Now you know why the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. By the way, I don't want to hear anybody ever again at the Ohio State University ever use the word awesome again unless you're talking about God or the heavens. Awesome shot, dude. Awesome shirt, dude. Awesome TikTok video. No! What are you going to say for this? In fact, I didn't read the whole verse a minute ago. Here's the entire verse. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. The closest thing in our experience to something infinite are the heavens. And they are to communicate to us what God's nature is like. God's love exceeds the height of stars equivalent to sand grains on 100,000 earths. And so does his justice. In fact, every attribute is infinite, which means he's able to remove our transgressions from us because he takes the punishment for our transgressions upon himself. He jumps on the grenade for us. Jesus isn't the only way as some sort of arbitrary claim. It's because there's no other way to reconcile infinite justice and infinite love. Now, when you look at a universe that has stars equivalent to sand grains on 100,000 Earths, and it's going to take you over 200,000 years at 5 miles a second between those sand grains, does that make you feel insignificant? It shouldn't. Why? Because as amazing as the heavens are, they're not made in the image of God, but you are. And here's the second aspect of the design argument. You're designed. This is you in the womb at 11 weeks. Question, is this animal, mineral, vegetable, or human? Human. In fact, let's go back earlier than 11 weeks. Let's go all the way back to when your mother and your father got together to conceive you. You guys had this talk before? I see some young people in here, so I'll try and be discreet. I also see some older people in here, so I'll try and be discreet as well, just in case if you've forgotten how this works. When your mother and your father got together to conceive you, your mother unconsciously perfumed her egg to attract your father, and then your father sent the entire population of the United States, 300 million soldiers, toward your mother's egg. And then there was a race. And you won. Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not special. You beat out 300 million others. You have blown away anything Michael Phelps has done. Now, seeing some of you limp in here earlier makes it hard for me to believe you were the fastest soldier in the gene pool. But you were. Now, your soldier was 20 to 30 times smaller than a grain of salt. Yet it contained half of the 3.5 billion letter software program we call your genome, your DNA. All the letters are in the right order. And your mother's egg was about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in an average book. And it contained the other half of the 3.5 billion letter genome, your software program, your DNA. All the letters are in the right order. And when your soldier and your egg came together, a new 100% genetic human being was created. You know, you have not received any more new genetic information from this point till right now. Your genetic information has just duplicated itself. In fact, there were only 4 things separating you from adulthood: time, air, water, and food. Those are the same 4 things that separate a 2-year-old from adulthood. Does this have implications on the abortion issue? Yeah, I think it does. We don't kill the 2-year-old. Why do we kill the unborn child in the womb? Genetically, it's the same. You say, wait a minute, Frank. You can't legislate morality. All right, no extra charge for this. This goes all the way back to our first book, creatively titled Legislating Morality. Okay? All laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? And when people say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? Do you notice you're imposing your morality on me right now? You're telling me I ought not impose ought nots, and you're imposing that ought not on me. Actually, there's a better answer. When someone says, don't impose your morality on me, I say this. This isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles don't have the law of the law written on their hearts. Look, everybody knows this morality, but not everybody likes it. In fact, if you have a problem with the morality, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. All right, no extra charge for that. Let's go back to this. From this point till right now, a construction project of astonishing complexity began taking place. Cells began multiplying at a rate of 4,000 cells per second. Brain cells began multiplying at a rate of 100,000 cells per second. For most of you anyway. Some cells became brain cells, others lung cells, others heart cells. How did they know how to do this? Nobody knows. Some cells went so far across you to become what they needed to become that it would be equivalent to you today walking across the United States alone. And that construction project continues to this very moment. You just made 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million. Knock it off. I mean, are you thinking about this? Are you going, wait a minute, Frank, time out, I got to concentrate. New red blood cells coming up. No, this is just happening. How is it happening? It's just happening automatically. How? Aristotle noticed something 2,400 years ago. He didn't know anything about blood cells, but he did notice that all of nature's going in a direction. For example, why does an acorn, if it's properly nourished, always go in the direction of becoming an oak tree? Why doesn't it become an elm tree? Or a birch tree, or a seahorse? You say, well, it's programmed to become an oak tree. Well, who programmed it? And by the way, is an acorn conscious? Is an acorn in the ground going, all right, what do I have to do to become an oak tree? No, it doesn't have a mind of its own. If it doesn't have a mind of its own, yet it reliably goes in a direction, there must be an external mind directing it toward an end. Aristotle called this the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s AD and said, this is going to be my fifth way to argue for God, that all of nature's going in a direction. If it's going in a direction, there must be a director. It's my words, not his. It's going in a direction. It's got a final cause. It's got a target. You ever notice how orderly the universe is? This is, by the way, this is why we can do science. Because the universe is orderly. It's reliable cause and effect. Why is it orderly? Because there's an orderer who's keeping everything going. In fact, this is not a Big Bang cause that we've already talked about. This is a cause every single second the universe exists. The being that keeps everything going is what we would call God. In fact, God is to the universe what a band is to music. If a band were up here playing music, the band would be creating and sustaining the music. What would happen to the music the second the band stopped playing? Music's over. Same thing is true with God. God creates the universe, and He creates the natural laws that keep it going, and He sustains the natural laws that keep it going, and He creates you and keeps you going every single second of existence. This is why the Apostle Paul could come along and said, in him we live and move and have our being. And Christ holds all things together. And the writer of Hebrews says God sustains all things by his powerful word. Do you realize Aristotle thought the universe was eternal? He was mistaken about that. But he said, even if the universe is eternal, you need a being like God, an unmoved mover, to keep everything going. Now, there's a lot more on this in the book, Stealing from God. We don't have time to get into it. We've got to talk about our third argument here. I said we're going to spend most of our time on God for a good reason. Now let's move on to the moral argument. Here's the question that I want to start with. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than... Oh, your quarterback's Joe Burrow. I'm sorry. Okay. But you get the idea. He beat Patrick Mahomes. But anyway, stay with me. How do you know your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? That's where the other team intercepts the ball, takes it back for a touchdown themselves. How do you know that? Not just the rules. What do you have to know? You need purpose, right? You need to know the purpose of the game. If the purpose of the game, if there's no purpose to the game, you can't say a touchdown for your team is better than you got your guy throwing a pick six. But once you know the purpose is for you to score more points than the other team, then you can say, this is a good play, this is a bad play. If there's no purpose to the game, you can't differentiate between plays. Right? Now, notice in football, the purpose of the game comes from outside the game. When they showed up to play the Super Bowl this year, the players didn't get on the field and go, okay, what are we here for? They didn't invent the rules. They didn't invent the purpose. That was already established by the commissioner and the owners, who every once in a while tweak the rules a little bit, right? They came from outside the game. Now, in football, the rules of the game are arbitrary. They could be different. But in life, the rules of the game are not arbitrary because they come from God. And these rules are based on his nature. If there's no God, you can't say, here's the right way to live life, and here's the wrong way to live life. Because if there's no purpose, you can't say this is good and this is bad. Just like in football, if there's no purpose to the game, you can't say a touchdown is better than a pick six. Does this make sense? You need purpose. Only if God exists is there purpose. In fact, if there is no God, the Nazis were not wrong. If there is no God, Putin isn't wrong. Why? Because if there's no standard beyond governments, how can you say Putin's wrong and Zelensky's right? How can you say Churchill was right and Hitler was wrong? You can't. That's how we convicted the Nazis at Nuremberg. We said there's a standard beyond your government. It's called natural law. In fact, Thomas Jefferson called it nature's law. C.S. Lewis called it the moral law. Now we call it international law. Same thing, based on God's nature. If there is no God, love is no better than rape. Oh, you may like love better, but not in an objective way. That's just your opinion. If there is no God, there are no human rights. I know here in the Ohio State University, when the tragedy with George Floyd took place, there was a lot of people claiming there were rights violated, right? Rightfully so. But you know, if there's no God, there are no rights to anything. Everything's just a matter of opinion. In fact, if there are no rights, if there is no God, slavery and racism aren't wrong. Neither's murder. Neither's rape. Everything is just a matter of opinion. If there is no God, tolerance is no better than intolerance. By the way, are Christians commanded to be tolerant? No, tolerance is too weak. Tolerance says hold your nose and put up with them. Love says reach out and help them. Christians are commanded to love, not be tolerant. In fact, in our culture we have the mistaken idea that love requires approval. Love does not require approval. Every parent knows this. How many parents do we have in here? All right, how many former children do we have in here? Okay, this applies to everybody, right? If your parent approved of everything you wanted to do as a child, was that parent loving? No, you need to stand in the way of evil if you're going to love someone, even if they hate you for it. This is why Thomas Sowell, the famous 91-year-old economist, put it this way. He said, when you tell somebody what they need to hear, you're helping them. When you tell somebody what they want to hear, you're helping yourself. How are you helping yourself? You're not telling them the truth because you don't want them to get mad at you. You're actually hurting them by not telling them the truth. In fact, if there is no God, you can't complain about the problem of evil. Why? Because if there's no God, there's no such thing as evil. Why? Because there's no such thing as good. See, only if God exists is there something known as good. And that's the only way you can have evil, because evil doesn't exist on its own. Evil exists as a lack in a good thing. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a good body, you got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? You got nothing. Doesn't exist, right? Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. What happens if you take all the car out of the rust? You got a Pinto, okay? You got nothing. It doesn't exist on its own. So if you're going to say something's evil, you're presupposing something's good. But if you're presupposing something's good, you're back to believing in God. And C.S. Lewis understood this. Early on in his life, he was an atheist because he went through World War I. He said, there's too much injustice in the world. There can't be a good God. Then one day he had an epiphany. He ultimately wrote it in Mere Christianity. Here's what he said. As an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, you wouldn't know what a crooked line was unless you knew what a straight line was. You wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. You wouldn't know something was immoral unless you knew what was moral. All this presupposes a standard. That standard can only exist if God exists. In fact, you could say it this way. The shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you got to have sunshine, right? Or light. Now, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil. But you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. So if evil exists, and we all know it does, then God exists. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. In fact, evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. And we can ask the question, why would God allow certain evils? We can do that during the Q&A if you want, but you can't say he doesn't exist. Last thing. What does it mean to submit? Nobody likes this word, submit. Let's break the word up. Submission, right? What does mission mean? It means you have a goal, you have a purpose, you're going somewhere, right? What does sub mean? It means you're putting your efforts under that mission. You're going to contribute to that mission. Do you realize that if there's no God, any one of your temporary missions is ultimately useless? Doesn't go anywhere, ultimately. Only if God exists is there an eternal mission. And we would be foolish if we didn't put our efforts under his overall mission. That's what submission means. There's something bigger than you that you're agreeing to put your energies toward. Why are we here? To know God, love God, and to make him known. You'd be crazy if you had another mission that was opposite that. If God exists, he does. All right. Now, you got to say, wait a minute, Frank, don't atheists have arguments against this? Yeah, they do, but they don't work. How so? Well, I can't say it any better than C.S. Lewis, so I'm just going to show you what C.S. Lewis said. Most atheists today are materialists. They believe all that exists are materials. There's no immaterial realm. You're nothing but a moist robot. Everything you think is due to the laws of physics. You don't have free will. You're a wet machine. And so Lewis takes this and points out that if you believe that, you've just made reason impossible. You can come up with every argument you want. None of them are valid if your worldview is true. Here's what he said. He said, suppose there was no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. As John Madden would say, boom. You can't say it any better than that. If you're a molecular machine, you shouldn't believe anything you think, but you can believe things you think. That's an effect. What explains that? Go from the effect to the cause. A mind. Look, at the end of the day, there's only two worldviews. Either matter gave rise to mind or mind gave rise to matter. Do you know matter by itself is dumb? Matter also had a beginning, and matter is composed. Anything that's composed has a composer outside of itself. But mind, pure mind, can be eternal and brought matter into existence. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what do these three arguments give us? They give us a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created all things and sustains all things to this very moment. We haven't even opened the Bible yet, and we seem to have a being that looks like the God of the Bible. So how are we going to know it's the God of the Bible? For that, we got to go to point 3. And you're probably wondering, Frank, you're running out of time here. No, this point doesn't take very long. Okay? Are miracles possible? Because God can use a miracle to let us know who is the true God. He can speak through people to say, listen to this person. Now, the problem is a lot of people think miracles are impossible. For example, Noah and the ark. All right. Christians, let's just keep this between us in here. Can we all agree on one thing? Noah and the ark is crazy. Please. Really? You believe this? Also, a resurrection. How many people in here have ever seen somebody rise from the dead? Crickets. Yet if you're a Christian, you have to believe in something none of us have ever seen. How rational is that? And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a whale of a tail or a tail of a whale? And what's the deal with Jonah? Can you really believe in Jonah? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? No, it's not the resurrection. The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. Well, here's the interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen. We actually have evidence that atheists agree with that the first verse could be true. They don't think it's God, but the data that says the universe had a beginning, they agree with. So if Genesis 1:1 is true, then every other verse is at least possible. Because if God can create the universe out of nothing, can he do the Noah miracle? Of course Noah's crazy, unless God exists. Of course resurrections can't occur, unless God exists. Of course Jonah's a fairy tale, unless God exists. Because if he can create the universe out of nothing, he can do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the universe, can he? And by the way, people will say, well, I can't believe in miracles because I've never seen one. That's not a good reason to disbelieve something. In fact, you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. You believe in your mind. Have you ever seen it? You're using it right now. You believe in the laws of logic. Have you ever seen those? You're using them right now. You believe in justice. Have you ever seen justice? Oh, you may have seen people being treated justly or unjustly, but you've never seen justice in itself because it's not something you see. It's an immaterial reality grounded in the nature of God. You've never seen love. Oh, you may have been loved or loved somebody, but you've never seen it. Why? Because it's not a physical thing that you see. In fact, in one of my debates I had with Christopher Hitchens, you guys remember Christopher Hitchens, the brilliant British atheist who sounded more brilliant than he was because he had a British accent? You remember him? In one of our debates, you can see this on our YouTube channel, a student from the University of New Jersey asked Hitchens this question, Christopher, what is love? And Christopher, being a materialist, had to come up with a materialistic answer. So he said, love is a chemical. And I said, don't tell that to your wife. Honey, do you love me? Yeah. Why? Because I got the chemical today. You know, tomorrow I might not have the chemical. Oh, love is not a chemical. It's a decision. A choice to seek what's best for the other person. It's not a chemical. You've never seen gravity. Oh, Frank, no. Look, there's gravity right there. No, you're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity. We really don't even know what gravity is. You know that? But we see its effects, and that's how we know God exists, by his effects. You've never seen George Washington. Yet you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a cause known as George Washington. Same thing is true with Jesus. You're reasoning from effect back to cause. Now, if miracles do occur, by the way, miracles don't need to occur today for Christianity to be true. There could be no miracles since the New Testament, and Christianity would still be true. I think they do occur. In fact, Craig Keener has a hernia-inducing 2-volume set on modern-day miracles you can look up. But even if there are no miracles since the beginning, or since the New Testament times, Christianity is still true. For atheism to be true, however, do you realize that every single miracle claim and spiritual experience in the history of the world has to be false? Is that possible? Yeah, that's possible. Is that reasonable? No. Every single one? False. Now, if miracles do occur, they have to be rare. Why? Because if they occurred all the time, they wouldn't get our attention as special acts of God. They have to be rare events. I mean, imagine if resurrections occurred routinely. What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody, you go, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Leroy just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back, right? No, it's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. They can't be regular events. In fact, the only way you can recognize a miracle is against the backdrop of repeated natural occurrences that happen over and over again. In fact, there are things that happen over and over again. We don't call them miracles, but we know there's intelligence behind them because they happen every day. They happen every day. We don't call them miracles, but they happen every day. How many people in here, every mother should raise your hand, how many people in here have witnessed your own children being born? And the men who were in the room, right? Now, when you see that, you don't go, evolution, right? You go, this is an effect that needs an explanation. What's the effect? A new human being who 9 months ago didn't even exist and now does. How does this just happen? It doesn't. There's a mind behind it, but it happens every day. That's why we don't call it a miracle. But we know it has the stamp of intelligence all over it. Now we can get to the key question. Is the New Testament true? We know the truth exists, that God exists, that miracles are at least possible. Is it true now that the most important miracle after Genesis 1:1 actually occurred, and that is the resurrection of Jesus? Now, I'm going to keep this short because we have limited time. I want to get to your questions, but I'm going to list right now 8 lines of evidence that the New Testament is telling the truth about what happened to Jesus, that he really rose from the dead. We're only going to look at 2 of them. I'm just going to list 8 of them. They all begin with the letter E because I used to be a Baptist. It has to be alliterated. Okay? Early sources, eyewitness details, embarrassing stories. I'm going to explain that here in a minute, as well as excruciating deaths. We're going to look at number 3 and 4. Embedded confirmation. This is all in the book, so I don't have time to explain it all. I do want to say that if you want to look this up, this number 5 here is probably the best evidence you've never heard about that the New Testament writers are independently witnessing the same historical event. What you need to Google is 2 words, undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences. And once you start reading these, you're going to go, yeah, they couldn't have made this up. Undesigned coincidences. Number 6, expected predictions. That deals with Old Testament prophecy. If I had only one Old Testament prophecy to make my case on, it would be Isaiah chapter 53, written 700 years prior to Jesus. Also extra biblical writers. There are 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life. People like Suetonius, Dallas, Phlegon, Josephus, these are household names I know, who briefly mention Jesus and the apostles. They're not eyewitnesses themselves, but when you read their brief references to Jesus and the apostles, they give the same storyline as the New Testament gives, that his disciples believed he rose from the dead and were willing to die for that belief. Also, number 8, the explosive growth of the church out of Jerusalem. Really hard to explain how Christianity could have originated in Jerusalem on an empirical claim, that Jesus had literally, physically resurrected from the dead, when the Jews and the Romans who wanted Christianity squashed could have squashed it easily by going to the tomb and taking the body out. They couldn't do that because Jesus was still using his body. Now, as I say, we don't have time to go through all these, but let's just spend a little bit of time on number 3 and number 4. What are embarrassing stories? Historians know that if there's something embarrassing to the author or authors in the text, it's probably true. Why? Because you're not going to make up stories that make yourself look bad. You're not going to embarrass yourself by making stuff up. You might try and make yourself look good, right? But you won't make stuff up to make yourself look bad. In fact, let me ask the question this way. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? Look, if you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good. And it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? Now, you don't lie to make yourself look bad, unless you're a pool shark temporarily, right? You might lie to make yourself look good, but you won't lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories they never would have invented. This is in the Old Testament too, but we're just looking at the New Testament. So much so that we're calling this the dove factor. They're not making this up. Let me just give you a few of these. Notice their leader, Peter, is called Satan by Jesus. Do you think they made this up? Do you think Mark, who wrote this down at one point, said to Peter, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. Look, I'm the leader here. This doesn't look good. And then Peter says, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? Denies him 3 times. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the possible exception of one, they all run away. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away! They all run away. And who are the brave ones? The women. The women are the brave ones. Now, who wrote the New Testament accounts down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? I mean, if I was there, I'd make myself look good, wouldn't you? I mean, I'd write something down like this. Let's see, we marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. That sounds pretty good. What do you think? Yep, good. John said, get out. Peter, roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. And then on Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say I was Mr. Sissy Pants. Why the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. And oh, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture? I know it's embarrassing to men, but just leave that aside for a second. That's another reason to believe they didn't make this up. But why wouldn't they have made it up in that culture? Because a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. If you wanted to get credibility, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. In fact, one of the women was a formerly demon-possessed woman. Oh, gee, what a credible witness. This is great. They're not making this up. I actually had a woman come up to me once, and she said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had not thought of that. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, hon, what? Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you the nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? Right? He's not going to tell you. I can't even believe this next verse is in the New Testament, but it is. Do you know at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, the biography of Matthew, where Jesus brings his disciples to give them the Great Commission? Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. He doesn't say make believers. He says make disciples, right? Right in that text, as his disciples are there, in verse 17, this is Matthew 28:17, it says this about the disciples who are there. Some believed, but some doubted. He's standing resurrected right in front of them. And it says they're doubting. It's like they're standing there. You see that guy over there? Yep. That guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. Can't be. Jesus is dead. The Romans killed him. It's him. Look, the Romans know how to crucify people. They put a spear in his side. Blood and water came out. They nailed him to a cross. They whipped him mercilessly. And if they didn't kill him, they could be killed. He's dead. It's him. It can't be. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in there. In John chapter 3, it says his own family came to seize Jesus and take him home because they thought he was out of his mind. That's embarrassing. His own family thinks he's nuts. Now, you may have heard the scholars say the New Testament writers embellish Jesus to be God. Oh, really? Then why is Mark chapter 3 in there, which is almost universally recognized to be the earliest gospel? This is not flattering. Jesus is called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. You think they made that up? He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, notice there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. The Messiah's bloodline. Who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Do you think they invented this? Do you think Matthew and Luke got together at one point when they're writing down the genealogies and said, you know what, I really think we ought to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes in here. What do you say, Rahab, Tamar? No. In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the Messiah's bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Judah, not a good guy. Read about him. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then, huh? Bathsheba is in there. In fact, when Matthew gets to her in the genealogy, he doesn't mention her name. What does he say instead? Uriah's wife. Ooh. Right? It's a slam. He's telling the truth. Who is Uriah? Husband of David. Husband of David. He loved Jonathan so much. No. Husband of Bathsheba, who David had killed so he could have Bathsheba. They're putting all this in there. And then Jesus is hung on a tree. You don't hang a Jewish Messiah on a tree. Why? Because according to Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. What curse was he under? The curse of sin we put him under. In fact, you notice there are two famous trees in the Bible. They both appear in Genesis. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Of course, we blew it at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but you know where the tree of life appears again? In the book of Revelation. Do you know there's a third tree that appears in between the two? It's the tree at Calvary that Jesus was nailed to. Because we disobeyed at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Jesus was nailed to a tree so he could take our punishment for us. And so if we accept what he's done, we'll be in the tree of life. This is not invented stuff. Now, there's more on embarrassing testimony. We got to do one more, and that's excruciating deaths. Now, this word excruciating literally comes from out of the crucifixion. That's what this means. These men who were in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected from the dead died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by saying, look, it never happened. Now, we have great evidence that 4 of these men did die martyrs' deaths. We have lesser evidence for the rest of them, but there's no evidence from the ancient world that says any of them ever recanted. And in fact, when you think about this, you've got to realize that all the writers of the New Testament, with the exception of Luke, all of them were all Jewish believers in Yahweh. They didn't believe that somebody could claim to be God. That would be blasphemy. And they didn't believe someone would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They knew somebody, that we'd all rise at the end of time, according to Daniel 12, but they didn't think somebody could rise in the middle of time. Why would these Jewish believers in Yahweh suddenly believe a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead? Why would they start this new religion? In fact, think about it. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? They're Jews. They get kicked out of the synagogue and then they get beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. Right? We're going to start a new religion. We are? Yeah. What's it going to get us? Well, first we get kicked out of the synagogue and then beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up! You know? What a great idea. Why haven't we thought of this before? No, they're not making this up. In fact, they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. Now, sometimes I get the question, if you're a Christian, maybe you do too, are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Yeah, there are. I mentioned them briefly earlier, okay? But you know what is often underneath that question? An illicit assumption. Here's the illicit assumption. You really can't trust the New Testament writers because, you see, they were biased. You can only trust the secular or non-Christian writers to figure out what really happened. Now, if you think about that for more than 10 seconds, you'll realize how silly that assumption is. Why? Because what did these people have to gain by saying it happened? Nothing. They had everything to lose. In fact, my friend J. Warner Wallace, he's been here at Ohio State University. He's a cold case homicide detective. He's been on Dateline more than any other detective because he solves murders that are decades old. And Jim took his detective skills and applied them to the greatest homicide of all time, the homicide of Jesus. And he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, where he takes these skills and looks at the evidence for Jesus. He also just wrote a great new book called Person of Interest. Anyway, Jim says whenever he finds a body he knows has been murdered, he says there's only 3 reasons why that guy's dead. Not 1,000 reasons. There's one of these 3 or a combination of the 3, and I already mentioned them earlier. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. Sex, money, or power. Why? Sex, money, and power are good things, but they're so good we'll sometimes take shortcuts to get them. That's why people murder, for sex, money, or power. That's why any of us sin, for sex, money, or power. Those are good things, but we'll take shortcuts to get them. So if you're going to say this was all some kind of grand conspiracy, you've got to figure out that one or more of those 3 motivators exist here. Question: did the New Testament writers get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, they didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers in leisure suits. Okay? Did they get power? No, they got persecution. Paul had power when he was a persecutor of Christianity, and when he became a Christian, he got persecuted. So they had no motive to make this up. Why would they die for a known lie? You say, wait a minute, Frank. Are you going to say that martyrdom proves Christianity? Because if so, don't you have to say martyrdom proves Islam? No. Why? Well, there's a number of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. Well, let me just give you the one major difference for our purposes here. The Muslim martyrs haven't witnessed anything that tells them that Islam is true. They just have faith. But the New Testament martyrs witnessed Jesus rise from the dead. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. Now, the last thing I'm going to say here is going to sound heretical for those of you that believe the Bible is the Word of God like I do, but it's not. Just stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Because Christianity did not originate with a book. Christianity originated with an event, the resurrection. Do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Frank, how could you be a Christian without the book of Romans? Was Paul a Christian before he wrote the book of Romans? Of course he was. That's why he wrote the book of Romans. Was John a Christian before he wrote the Gospel of John? Of course he was. That's why he wrote the Gospel of John. They didn't read this stuff in a book. They saw it themselves. And they wrote it down so we could know about it. But Christianity would be true if they never wrote about it. We just wouldn't know much about it. Do you see the point here? In fact, you could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have documents written in the first century by Bible-believing Old Testament Jews saying a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead in the middle of the time unless a man actually claimed to be God and predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead. That's where the evidence leads us. And there's more evidence in the books. You can go further. The big 4 questions. Does truth exist? Somebody says there's no truth. You're going to say, is that true? Does God exist? How do you know God exists? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a cause known as creation, design, morality. and also mind. Are miracles possible? The greatest miracle of all has already occurred that even atheists are admitting the data for, the creation of the universe out of nothing. So is it possible Jesus rose from the dead? Yeah, in fact, there's evidence for it. Evidence they wouldn't have invented. So if you want to go further, there's that word you need to text again, evidence, to this phone number, 855-909-0582. There are some books and DVDs out there. We're now teaching online courses. In fact, I'm about to teach an online course starting next week called Jesus versus the Culture. And Elisa Childers, you may know about, is next month going to teach a course on progressive Christianity. So if you're interested, go to our website for that. We're on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. In fact, we're so into social media, we've actually combined these three into one social media platform. We call it YouTwitface. You guys signed up for YouTwitface yet? It's kind of a Jersey thing. We're on Instagram too, by the way. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. Check it out. Also, we're on TV, as I mentioned earlier. And if you don't do anything else, just download the free Cross-Examined app. 2 words in the App Store, Cross-Examined. Cross-Examined. It has the podcast on it. It has the TV show streaming live. It has a quick answer section. It's all right there. Now, I haven't told many audiences this yet, but my son, who is in the military right now, he's a major in Intel. He spent a lot of time on Russia right now. He's also a graduate of our seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, and he and I have just written a new book called Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God. This book is not out yet. It comes out May 3rd. But, by the way, here are the movie franchises we investigate. Captain America, Iron Man, Harry Potter. Harry Potter? Yeah, you'd be surprised. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Batman, Wonder Woman. If you go to this website right now, HollywoodHeroesBook.com, and you pre-order the book, we're going to send you the audio book for free. This is how you can get young people interested in Christianity, because all of these heroes that you see right here, all these movie franchises, are all pointing to the ultimate hero. Who's that? Jesus of Nazareth. Hollywood can't help but making stories that emulate the greatest story ever told. So check that out if you would. Okay, last thing, it's true. So what? So what if Christianity's true? Well, you know what the best news is? Someone actually did die for you. Now, when I was in the Navy, I was in naval aviation, and we had to earn golden wings, which were fairly hard to earn. But there's nothing more difficult in the Navy, certainly, and virtually any other military to earn than a golden trident. That's what the SEALs earn. Very few people that start SEAL training make it through. Maybe just a few % make it through. But those that do wear that golden trident with pride. It is their identity. When Michael Monsoor was buried in Rosecrans Cemetery just outside of San Diego, just about every Navy SEAL on the West Coast showed up for his funeral. And when they passed his casket, they took off their tridents and pressed them into his casket. They took their identity and put their identity in the one that died for them, the one that saved them. That's what we're supposed to do. But no, our culture says, don't do that. Put your identity in your political party. Or put your identity in your race. There's only one race, the human race. Or put your identity in your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your sexual orientation. Or your school or your bank account or your vocation. You know, none of those things are ultimate. You can lose all that stuff. You know the only thing you can't lose? You can't lose God. You can lose everything else. And if you put your identity in anything temporal, ultimately it's going to disappoint you. We're supposed to put our identity in our Savior, the one that died for us. In fact, John, the biographer of Jesus, his biography is called The Gospel of John, says that he has given you the right to become a child of God. How do you become a child of God? You accept what he's done. Do you know Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity, you receive your identity? If you have to achieve your identity, all the pressure's on you. Not only that, there's always somebody that can do it better. And what happens when you, suppose you put your identity in your job and then you can no longer do your job, or you lose your job? What's your identity then? No, your identity is in your Savior. You can never lose him. And this Savior didn't just die, he also rose again, which means every one of us is going to rise again. The only question is, where are we going to rise to? All right. What we're going to do now is go to questions. And since no one likes to ask the first question, we're going to move right on to the second question. And I do want to point out, by the way, that here is that number again. I also, if you don't mind, if you want to give us some feedback on this presentation so we can improve it, whether you like it or not, that's fine. Just use that same number, except text the word event to do the survey to this number. If you want the PowerPoint, text the word evidence. So we'll start over here with Donna. Go ahead, Donna.
I have a question. With fine-tuning Earth, with the fine-tuned Earth, why are we hearing so much about global warming? Is it real?
Oh, question, is global warming real? Well, there's a couple of questions you have to ask for with global warming. The first question, is the planet warming? And most scientists will say, yes, it is warming. The second question is man causing the warming? Because, you know, we've had ice ages before, and we've had desert periods before. It seems like the climate changes anyway, right? The third question is, if man is causing it, what can we do about it? And here's the key question, and at what cost? Right? Because if you try and, in fact, let me back up. Back in 2008, I have a cousin through marriage who works at the UN in Geneva. We happened to be in Switzerland speaking at some churches there. And he said, what do you think about climate change? And I said, well, I don't know a lot about it, but I do know this, that according to the data that we've seen, even if the United States were to reduce its global emissions to zero, it would have virtually zero effect on global temperatures. Why? Because China and India and other developing countries will not agree to reduce their global or their carbon emissions. Why? Because these are impoverished countries that need to create jobs and create manufacturing in order for them to survive. We might have the luxury of reducing some of our emissions, but people elsewhere, when they reduce their emissions, they're out of work. And that's a bigger health problem than global temperatures going up 0.5 degrees. See? So at what cost? You have to answer the question, at what cost? So is it warming? It appears to, but it could be cyclical because it's been cyclical before. Are human beings causing it? Maybe we are, maybe we're not. If we are, can we reduce it enough to affect it? And at what cost? Those are all questions that a lot of people don't ask the cost factor. That's why right after Putin invades Ukraine, John Kerry is going around the world talking about, oh, what's this going to do for climate change? People are fleeing for their lives. And he's talking about climate change. Can you talk tone deaf or what? Sorry, next time I'll tell you how I really feel. All right? All right? Thank you, Donna. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I don't know. Is that me or what?
I'm not controlling it.
All right. Go ahead, sir. What's your name?
My name's Cameron.
Cameron, go ahead. Get a little closer to the mic if you would.
Oh, well, first, thanks for your presentation.
Yes, sir.
Great to finally see you. I've been watching your podcast for a long time. And hi, Mom.
Hey,
I've got a question about the Big Bang.
Yes.
I've seen a surprisingly common response to the Big Bang as evidence for the beginning of the universe. The claim is that we don't know what happened before the Planck time, as in the time right after the supposed singularity. How would you respond to this?
I would say, what's the odds-on favorite? If space, matter, and time literally had a beginning out of nothing, what could have caused that? It seems a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause. In fact, there was a video put out recently by a group that wanted to attack the Kalam cosmological argument. And this argument, by the way, has really been brought forward in the past 30 or 40 years by Dr. William Lane Craig. For those of you who don't know William Lane Craig, you ought to know about him, reasonablefaith.org. And Craig has written probably the most on this argument than just about anybody else. And just this past a few weeks, Craig has responded to this video that's trying to poke holes in the Kalam cosmological argument. And as you'll see, I think if you read it or look at it with an open mind, you'll realize Craig is right. they have not defeated the Kalam cosmological argument. If space, matter, and time had a beginning, which is what the evidence shows, the odds-on favorite is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator. Some people don't like that. Fine, you don't like it. And if you want to call it God, don't call it God. Call it Bubba. Because it doesn't prove the Christian God, right? It could be a deistic God. In fact, here's the interesting thing, Cameron. Both Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, two very prominent atheists. In fact, Lawrence Krauss would consider himself an anti-theist. A number of years ago, he wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, where he tries to explain how the universe could come from nothing without a cause, or without God, certainly. I think he failed. In fact, I responded to that book in the Stealing from God book. But both of these gentlemen have said, you know, one could make a pretty good case for a deistic God. A God that created the universe and set it up and fine-tuned it, but then left it. They said, well, it's not a case we would accept, but we could discuss it. I mean, you could make a reasonable case for that. But you know what? The Kalam cosmological argument only gets you really deism, right? It's not saying whether God is later involved in the universe. That the teleological argument does that. The moral argument does that. But the Kalam cosmological argument that says that the universe had a beginning, it doesn't say whether God gets involved later or not. So why would you object to a deistic God, or let me say it another way, why would you object to a theistic God but not a deistic God? I think I know. A deistic God doesn't bring morality with him, but a theistic God does, right? A theistic God doesn't want God, or some atheists don't want God to exist if he's a theistic God, because he's going to bring moral authority with him. He's going to try and tell us how we ought to behave, how we ought to live, and some people don't want to hear that. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cameron.
Actually, if I could...
Sure.
I think this is more of an objection to the second premise of the Kalam.
Okay.
It's more saying if you try to use the Big Bang as evidence that the universe had a beginning, there's this problem where we don't really know if there's a singularity. Do you have any response to that?
Well, I don't even think you need a singularity to show a point of infinite density, which if you think about, it's just said that way, but there's nothing that can be infinitely dense, nothing finite that can be infinitely dense, right? Anything finite is finite, and even that can't be infinitely dense. It's what it's basically saying. It's saying the entire weight of the universe goes over zero space volume. So you've got the whole weight of the universe and yet no space or time. So it's the weight of the universe over zero, and you can't divide by zero, so they just say, well, it's just infinity then. Okay? But you don't need science to know, you don't need science to know that there had to be a beginning. Let me illustrate this.
Slide, yep.
Let's say we got a timeline here, and we don't know when this timeline began. Okay? Here's today, right? Here is yesterday, there's the day before yesterday, there's last week, right? Here's the question. Can this timeline be infinite into the past? You guys are starting to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher right now. Like, it cannot be infinite into the past. Why? Because if there were an infinite number of days before today, then you would never get to today. Why? Because you still have to live an infinite number of days before today, and you can't traverse an infinite number of days. There can only be a finite number of days if today has arrived. Today is here, so there can only be a finite number of days. I know this argument can give you intellectual constipation, okay? But think about it. There has to be only a finite number of days before today. Because if there were an infinite number of days, there'd always be another day before today that you'd have to live. But since today is here, there can only be a finite number of days. So if the past were infinite, today never would have arrived. But here's today. Now, since this is the case, whatever created time, whenever that was, way back when, whatever created time must be timeless, right? This cause is outside of time. And if this cause is outside of time, that means that this cause didn't have a beginning. So the question, who made the cause or who made God, is an illegitimate question because he's outside of time, which means he didn't have a beginning, which means he didn't have a cause. Does this make sense? All right?
Yep. Thank you, Dr.
All
Turek.
right, thanks, Cameron. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hello. Oh, I'm Don.
Hey, Don, go ahead, sir.
Oh, so I wrote my question down in case I forgot. So I know that hell is separation from God.
Uh-huh.
Does that mean that if you go to hell for eternity in the afterlife, does that mean that life on earth is the only time and opportunity to decide whether you want to be with God? So basically, can you be saved from hell if you change your mind?
The answer, according to the scriptures, it's appointed a man once to die and then the judgment. So it does not appear that there is a second chance after death. This is Hebrews 9:27. And C.S. Lewis has famously said something like, God knows when the final decision has been made. Since God wants more people to be saved than we do, he wants all to be saved. He's infinitely loving. If he knows, and he does know because he's infinite knowledge, if he knows that if he keeps somebody alive another day, they're going to believe, he'll do that.
Okay.
But if he knows that no matter what he does, they're not going to believe, then they're not going to believe now, and they're not going to believe in the afterlife either.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Don. Yes, sir.
How you doing? My
Yes, sir.
name's
What's your name?
Keelan.
Hey, Kalam. How you doing?
All right. Quick question that's always bothered me. Nephilim, are they fallen angels that procreated with human women? Were they the line of Seth procreated with the daughters of the men of Lamech? Or was it just Nephilim was a description of like a bad person? Because after the Nephilim were mentioned, I believe God wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, I think that Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, I don't know if you've heard of this Old Testament scholar, has an entire series on this, Who are the Nephilim? And since he's an Old Testament scholar and I'm not, I'm deferring to him. And he thinks that the Nephilim were truly the product of these spiritual beings mating with human mothers and creating this group of giants called the Nephilim. And you can read more about that on his website. Just look for Dr. Michael Heiser. Or you can listen to his podcast. It's called the Naked Bible Podcast.
And second question
Yes.
is spin off of that.
Yes.
Why does it seem that God perpetuates evil? As in, when he told Noah to build an ark and he flooded the world, he told him to bring 2 of everything.
Right.
So I'm assuming that he brought another man and another woman other than Noah and his family?
He brought 8 people, Noah did, according to the account. What do you
But
mean another man and another woman?
He mentioned to bring his family with him.
Yes.
But he also told him to bring 2 of every species.
Oh, and I think that just had to do with the animals. It didn't have to do with men and women because his whole family was on board.
Okay.
So-
it just seems like God allows evil to perpetuate.
Why do you say that? What do you mean by that?
Because he wiped out creation,
Right?
evil's still here.
Oh, sure. He allows it to perpetuate. I see what you're saying. Well, because we have free will. In fact, a number of years ago, I was at Michigan State University, not the Wolverines. Okay. I was at Michigan State, and I knew there was an atheist in the audience because he sat through the entire presentation like this. I mean, he didn't crack a smile once, and I had some pretty good jokes in there. Right? Anyway, when the event was over, his hand shot up, and I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "If there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world?" And I said, "Sir, that is an excellent question. Maybe because if he did, he might start with you and me, because we do evil every day." You ever notice we complain about people doing evil? We never complain about ourselves. We're always saying, "Hey, God, why don't you stop him?" Or, "God, why don't you stop her?" Here's my question. If God were to stop evil at midnight tonight, would any of us still be alive at 12:01? No, I wouldn't be alive. Why does God allow evil? Because he wants this to be a moral universe where we can make real moral choices. So he gives us free will, which allows us to love, but it also allows us to do evil. What's God going to do ultimately with evil? He's going to quarantine it in a place called hell, where people are still free, but they're not free to interfere with the well-being of others because now there's a great gulf fixed between hell and heaven. So that's ultimately what God's going to do with evil. In the meantime, you know what God has done about evil? He's taken it upon himself. He came into the universe, added flesh to his deity, and allowed the very creatures that rebelled against him to torture and kill him so he could take their punishment on himself. This is why it's the greatest story ever told.
True.
Right?
True.
Thanks. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Jake.
Jake, go ahead, sir.
So out of all the three arguments that you use for God, cosmological, the design argument, and the moral argument, which of the three do you think is the strongest, and why is it stronger than the others?
Good question. It depends on your perspective. I think that in today's age, it's the moral argument because people can ignore the creation. They can ignore design. It's nearly impossible to ignore morality because you deal with it every day, especially on a college campus. Look, when you're on a college campus, you have a very developed sense of justice. Now, that's a good thing. The problem is I see a lot of people knowing there's justice out there, but they can't justify where it comes from. They think they have rights, and they do. But if you ask them, why do they have rights? Where do rights come from? They have no idea. Rights do not come from governments. If that were the case, they wouldn't be rights, they'd be preferences. Governments are instituted among men, said Jefferson, to secure rights. Not to give them, not to take them away, but to secure them. And this is why he says in the Declaration of Independence, when a government fails to secure rights, the people have the right to overthrow that government and install a government that will protect their rights. Does that make sense, Jake?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess it does depend on your perspective, Jake. Some people like the science stuff. Other people like the... I will tell you this before you go. The one other thing that Christopher Hitchens said, the guy I debated a couple times, for him, the biggest argument for God that he had trouble with was the fine-tuning. Right? Like, how do you explain fine-tuning without a mind? You can't. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi. How are you?
Yes, sir. What's your name?
I'm Zach.
Hey, Zach. Go ahead.
Okay. So obviously the Bible says sex before marriage is wrong. But is there any reasons that you can give either from or outside the Bible that tell us why it's wrong?
Okay. Great question. Certainly, one of the things that Paul says, flee sexual immorality. He says every sin that or most sins a man commits outside his body, but sexual immorality a man sins against his body. Jesus also said that it's not what comes out of a man that makes him unclean, or what comes out of a person that makes that person unclean. What goes into that person. I'm sorry. I got it backwards. It's not what goes into a person that makes him or her unclean, like the foods. It's what comes out of a person. He mentions theft, sexual immorality, covetousness, a whole bunch of other things, okay? The biblical worldview is that we are to create like God created, and to do that, we are to get together, man and women, and procreate in a relationship that's committed to one another, not only for companionship, not only for love, but also to procreate and bring up the next generation. If you look at societies where the biological two-parent family breaks down, which is our society now, all sorts of trouble exists. All sorts of trouble is created. Think about the problems we have today. Why is there poverty? One of the biggest reasons there's more poverty than there was at other points in history is because the biological family's broken down. Why is there abortion? Because people are procreating outside of wedlock and babies can be inconvenient. Why is there child abuse? Because people don't stay together and care for their children. Unfortunately, all the responsibility goes to the mother in most cases. It's hard enough being a mother when you have a husband. It's nearly impossible. I mean, people do it, they make heroic efforts, but it's really hard to be a single parent. And it's just hard. It wasn't meant to be that way. There's also other problems that arise from this. You know, in our culture, people think that sex is just physical. Think about this. If sex is just physical, why is it worse if somebody rapes you than if somebody just physically assaults you? Why is it worse if somebody rapes you than somebody who just physically assaults you? Because you know sex isn't just physical. Sex is emotional. It's spiritual. It's psychological. I mean, sex is like fire. You put fire in a fireplace, it's wonderful. It'll warm you. You get it anywhere else in your house, it will burn your house down. Maybe not immediately, but over the long term, you will. In fact, let's just talk about divorce for a second, because Christians don't talk about that enough. I submit to you that probably half the people in this room have been scarred by divorce. Scarred. Look, my dad just died 2 years ago. He was 84 years old when he died. If he had divorced my mother when he was 83, I'd be scarred. And I was 58 when that happened. It scars people. Sex is not just physical. There's so much more to sex. But we want to treat it like it's just another commodity, like it's just another physical act. It's not just another physical act. In fact, it's the only thing that people can't do on their own. You can't create another child by yourself. You can eat by yourself. You can do 1,000 other things by yourself. The one thing you can't do is create new life without your opposite. So there's a lot more to this than just the physical act. Does that make sense, Don?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks. Jennifer. How are you?
Hi. Okay. First, I want to say from one veteran to another, thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I didn't know you had served too. Thank you.
Yes. Also in the Navy. So my question is, I don't know what's wrong with my brain. I cannot seem to truly grasp the understanding of the Trinity.
Okay.
At all.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, Jennifer. So, good night, everyone. All right, well, if you'd completely grasp the Trinity, that would mean you'd be infinite too. But you're not, and neither am I. But let me just kind of give you maybe a way of looking at the Trinity that may or may not be helpful. Hang on, I'm just looking for a particular slide here that can help us do that. Here it is. What is the Trinity? There's no perfect illustration of the Trinity, but let's try and use one that I think is pretty good. And that is, think of a triangle. The triangle is one triangle, but it has 3 corners. And in the corner, you have one person, the Father. In another corner, you have another person, the Son. And in the third corner, you have the Holy Spirit. They all share a divine nature. They're all equally God, but there are 3 persons in God. Jesus, on the other hand, he shares in the divine nature, but he also has a human nature which is not intermingled with the divine nature. So this is Jesus' human nature. So whenever you ask a question about Jesus, you always have to answer 2 questions. Because, people will say, well, how could Jesus be God if he didn't know when he was coming back, right? Well, did Jesus know when he was coming back as man? No. Did he know when he was coming back as God? Yes. Did Jesus get hungry? As man, yes. As God, no. Right? So you always have to ask 2 questions when you're talking about Jesus. But in the divinity, all these 3 persons in the Trinity are equally divine. They have different roles, though, different functions. You have a lover, a loved one, and a spirit of love. Right? God plans salvation. The Son accomplishes salvation, and the Holy Spirit convicts the world that they need salvation. You can look at it another way, too. You could say that in the Trinity, you have 1 what and 3 whos. You have who 1, who 2, and who 3, but in who 2, you have 2 whats. You have what 1 and what 2. So whenever you're talking about who 2, you got to say which what are you talking about. You talk about 1 or what 2 when you're talking about who 2, because if you're talking about who 2, you got to know which what are you talking about. This is the Abbott and Costello theology here. Now, for me, I think the Trinity, although it can't be completely comprehended, it can be apprehended. Just like you can stand in front of an ocean and apprehend there's an ocean in front of you, even if you can't completely comprehend everything going on in that ocean, right? For me, the Trinity actually solves problems rather than creates them. Because if God is, say, just one being, monotheistic being with only one person like Allah, how do you have love before there was a creation? But in the Trinity, you have a lover, a loved one, and a spirit of love from all eternity. And this, by the way, is the model for human relationships, too. This is the model for marriage here, too. These people are equal, these persons in the Godhead are equally divine, but they have different roles, different functions. And in a marriage, you have different functions, too. So the Trinity, I think, actually solves problems rather than creates them. And I actually think that we can apprehend it even if we can't completely comprehend it. It's not against reason, it's beyond reason. It's not a contradiction to say that there's one God with 3 persons in one God. It would be a contradiction to say that there's one God and three gods at the same time and in the same sense. We're not saying that. We're saying there's one God with three persons. Does that make sense,
Yes,
at least
sir.
partially?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. All right. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hello, my name is Elson.
Ellison. Go ahead, sir.
No, Elson.
Allison.
E-L-S-O-N, Elson.
Elson. Got
Yeah.
it. All right. Thank you.
So first, I just want to say I really enjoyed your presentation. If everyone could, if I could take the lead for a second, I think you deserve another round of applause.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I follow you a lot, and the last time you were here, there was one question that I think you didn't really engage with or answer, and I wanted to ask it again, if that's
go
okay
ahead,
with
yeah.
you. So there was a man named John Allegro who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he concluded that Jesus was a mushroom. So, unless you eat some psilocybin mushrooms, you are taking it on faith that Jesus was not a mushroom. So are you willing to go home and eat some shrooms?
We're really out of time now, Ellison, because I haven't heard this before. Well, actually, someone said something about mushrooms, but I've never heard this theory except here in this class. So I would say, what do you mean a mushroom? That's the first question.
I can give you the book. Do you want the book reference?
No. You can explain it to me. What do you mean, or what does he mean by mushroom?
Sure. So there's this idea that John Allegro proposed that every story in the Bible is actually a metaphor, a disguised metaphor for fertility cults, which ingested mushrooms. I forgot what the name of the specific mushroom was, but there's all this like philological kind of things he does, and it's a really interesting book.
All right, I got it. Okay, let me say this. What evidence does he have for this?
What evidence does he have?
Yeah.
So the main evidence is linguistic evidence. So for example, there's in Jewish sources, Jesus is called sometimes the son of Pantera, which is related to the Greek word panter, and this was a word used for mushrooms. We have Christos, which John Allegro would say is related to Christos, which was also another word used to describe plants. And it's just a really interesting book. I just wanted to know your opinion on it.
Well, I haven't read it, so I don't really have an opinion, but there's so much historical data that we've been through and even couldn't go through that it couldn't be just a metaphor. There's historical data involved. These are real people who lived a real life about 2,000 years ago. In fact, I didn't have time to go through this, but when you look at the eyewitness details, there are more than 30 people named in the New Testament that are known to be historical figures outside the New Testament from outside sources like Herod, all the Herods, like Pilate, like Caiaphas, like Jesus himself is mentioned outside the New Testament documents as being an historical figure, even John the Baptist. These are all real people, so they're not, it's not a complete metaphor, even if there are metaphors in the Bible. This is good historical data. It would be like saying, would we expect, say 2,000 years from now, that the cult of Star Wars would be the most influential story in the history of mankind if it was just a movie? Nobody would say that 2,000 years from now, Star Wars will have taken over the world like Jesus has taken over the world here. Jesus is the most influential human being in history. And if you get my friend J. Warner Wallace's book, Person of Interest, you're going to see that this was not a metaphor. This was a real person. Okay?
So, are you going to go home and eat some shrooms, though?
Negative. I'm going to have pepperoni on my pizza. So
Got it.
All right? All right, next. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Gabriel from New Jersey.
Gabriel from New Jersey. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gabriel.
I appreciate that. Disclaimer, this is probably going to get me in a lot of trouble with the world, but we'll see what happens.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so thy examinational selective truth claim thereof thy created mankind disobedient rebellion within this Christianity's foundational doctrinal doctrine. Duration of this time in this space through this matter by this existence engulfed by thy fall of created mankind's accepted narrative narration of our ancient earthly father, thy first Adam, and our mother of all thy living, Eve, are truly guilty of an open, willing rebellion thereof thy father of lies, thy serpent's hidden agenda, in a knowledgeable, unordained disobedience within thy only known law, placed upon created mankind, bounded by...
Hey, Gabriel, hang on
Yeah.
just a sec. I'm not tracking with you. Is there a
So-
question in here?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Just hit me with the question.
Did Adam rebel against thy God?
Adam and Eve both did, yes. Okay, so...
Okay, so the question is, did he rebel? Yes, they disobeyed, but did they willingly, willfully, knowingly ate of the knowledge of good and evil?
Yeah, they did. And in fact, here's what Adam did after God metaphorically came to him. There are metaphors in the Bible, right? God knew where Adam was when he says, you know, where are you? He knows all that. These are rhetorical questions. But when God did confront Adam and basically asked, what did you do? What did Adam say? The woman you gave me did this. Notice he threw Eve under the bus, just like a lot of men do now, right? They throw their wives under the bus instead of going, honey, hang on, I'll handle God, right? He threw her under the bus. So, yes, he blamed God for giving him Eve and said that she did it, but he did it too. So,
my response would be, so one of my talents, I'm very grateful to know that Adam never knew. The whole problem with this is that we are assuming that he knew that Eve was the one that took from the fruit. He wasn't there with her. According to the narration, and this is the problem.
Well, here's the narration. He just said, the woman that you gave me the fruit and I ate it. So he knew that she had it because she gave it to him.
He was righteously justified in saying that. That's why thy God went to the woman to see why did she do this, because Adam never knew. She said that she was beguiled by the serpent. She never told that bit of information to Adam.
Okay,
So,
but look, where are we going with this? What's the point? Suppose you're right about it. What is it? What's the cash value of this?
so basically, the consequential choice within soulful repercussions throughout reapful ramifications bounded by mankind's inheritance. The punishments that Eve, the mother of all thy living, received, all the women today are still bound by thy sanctificational judgment, because in Proverbs, one of the verses was thy God, thy Father, saying to mankind, do not forsake thy mother of thy law. And if you go all the way to Corinthians, Apostle Paul, he mentioned the law. That was referring all the way to the beginning because it was still sanctified. So that's one of the big issues and the problems that I see, is that the reason why we have so many abortions in this nation is because they're following the corruption.
Yeah, the whole world is corrupt. That's the whole point. The whole world is fallen. Yes, we agree.
I will say more in details. I mean, obviously, I have more information to explain if you're interested. If not,
Well,
I understand.
maybe we can talk afterwards, but we got a
Absolutely.
long line of people. Thank you, Gabriel. Go ahead, sir. What's your name?
Seth,
Go
thanks,
ahead,
Frank,
Seth.
for coming out here. I've got a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to give you the skeleton of the sentence or the
Okay,
question.
go ahead.
And I've got a couple of caveats that I want to add to this. So the skeleton is, for those who are convinced or strongly inclined towards the God of the Bible, and given that Paul tells Timothy to entrust sound doctrine to faithful men, how can young people trust historical Orthodox Christianity? So here's the caveat. Since most millennials today are steeped in a sociological approach to ethics and morality, especially amongst evangelicals and Christian deconstructionists, for those who are convinced or strongly inclined towards the God of the Bible, and given that Paul tells Timothy to entrust sound doctrine to faithful men, how can young people trust historical Orthodox Christianity when they are subtly and steeped in the philosophy of Marx that morality is created by the powerful to control people, many of whom feel evangelicalism, kind of an amorphous term, or historic Christianity is just big business to back oil moguls or subjugate women to kitchens, not my words. Why should they not trust Christian sources for spirituality like Richard Rohr, Boltz-Weber, Harris, the Deconstructionist podcast, et cetera, who are seen more faithful in an empathetic way? After all, as you're well aware, that you do have Robbie's quote on the front of your books.
So the nub of the question is, why should young people trust the Bible rather than the culture?
Well, actually, historical Orthodox Christianity. So this idea of entrusting sound doctrine to faithful men. Because we look back to whether it's the Reformers or other people within the context of Orthodox Christianity, what we have coming out is kind of this deconstructive, or rather intersectional approach to Christianity, saying that, again, Marx's idea is that the powerful create morality.
Okay,
it's
well,
pseudo-spirituality.
here's the problem. If that's the case, when Marx had power, then he created it. So why should we trust Marx? See, it's a self-defeating position, ultimately, to say, for example, there are some people who adhere to critical theory who say if you're trying to use reason to make your point, that's a power play. In other words, you can't use reason, you can just use story. Well, they're using reason right there to say that. Is that a power play true? Two, if all truth claims are power plays, so is the truth claim that says all truth claims are power plays. So it's a self-defeating position. And what they have right here is there's only two ways that you can govern a people: through principle or through power. You're going to either do what's right, or you're just going to use might to impose your will on people. Those are the two ways you can do it. This is why our founding starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. So we're either going to believe that rights come from God, or whoever has the most power gets to rule. Those are our two choices. And if you, not you, but whoever you're talking to, if you think that putting power in the hands of just a few people is a good idea, history will tell you otherwise. In fact, what's going on in Russia right now? Who has all the power? What went on in Hitler's Germany? Who had all the power? What went on in Stalin's Soviet Union? One guy had all the power. How about Mao in China? How about Pol Pot in Cambodia? You get dictators, and they validate Lord Acton's famous decree that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. That's why our government, our founders said we need to have a balance of powers. We need to have separated powers. Actually, it's not really a balance. There's separated powers. You've got the legislative, judicial, and executive branch. And which one is supposed to be the strongest of those three? Legislative, right? That's closest to the people. The legislative branch can impeach the other two branches, but the other two branches can't impeach the legislature. Okay? So our government knew, our founders knew, that they didn't want to put too much power in any one or two people's hands. They had to spread it around. So if Marxists want to think that we're just going to have this utopia when we put our power, we give all the power to one person who dictates to us, that's a recipe for disaster.
The question is not necessarily about civil law. It has to do with Orthodox Christianity.
Okay. Question. Did Christians have any power for the first 300 years? No. Christianity flourished because people were persecuting it. They had zero power. It wasn't until Constantine made Christianity tolerable, and then later in that century it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire, did trouble really brew, and people were not really following Christ anymore. They got too much power, it went to their heads. And in fact, you want to read a good book on this, read John Dixon's book, Bullies and Saints. John Dixon's from Australia, who wrote a history of the church, one chapter on each century, and he points out all the good the church has done, all the evil the church has done. And he said the good thing about church history is there were always reformers within the church when people got out of line and got away from the scriptures. And there are reformers right now saying that. The people who are saying deconstruction is a bad thing. Because you know why people are deconstructing now? It's not because they found evidence that the Bible isn't true. It's because they want to side with the culture. They want to side with usually the sexual movements. It's a sexual revolution. And that's really the issue. That's really what I've seen several people deconstruct, and I've never seen anyone say that, oh, it's because I didn't think it was true anymore. What they've said was, well, they said that, but they haven't given any evidence. What they've said was that the LGBTQ movement has been treated poorly, and they've been right to a certain extent. But now they want to side and say these relationships are good and blessed by God, and so I can't believe what the Bible says about it anymore. This is not an argument. This is a preference.
Thanks, sir.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hello, Jerry.
Hey, Jared. Go ahead.
How you doing? Thank you.
Are you Jerry?
Yeah, Jerry.
Oh, Jerry from before.
Yep,
Okay,
yep,
Jerry,
before.
go ahead.
Thank you for coming out, Dr. Turek. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Hey, what, you guys can't stay for 4 hours? Come on. Go ahead, Jerry.
My question is if when opening up to a non-believer about Christ and the Gospels, and the person's rebuttal comes down to, well, the Earth is hundreds of millions of years old, and because we have found dinosaur bones, what would your response be?
I'm absolutely certain the universe is at least 60 years old.
But
I'm going to throw my mom in there. It's at least 84.
But what about actual dinosaur bones?
I think they're real dinosaur bones, and they're probably right. They're millions of years old.
Okay.
And I think the Bible does not tell you how old the universe is, although some
Correct.
people try and say it does. And there's a number of reasons for this. Since we got a long line, I won't go into all the reasons. We have videos on our YouTube channel
Sure.
that explain this. But what does the first verse of the Bible say? It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, when did God create the heavens and the earth?
In the beginning.
In the beginning. Does it say when the beginning is?
No.
You say, okay, well, when does, you say, what about the days? The days don't begin till verse 3. If you want to take a hyper-literal view of Genesis, the heavens and the earth are created before the days ever begin. Right? I think the Bible leaves it indeterminate. Is it a legitimate interpretation to say that the Bible teaches the universe is thousands of years old? It's certainly a legitimate interpretation. Is it the right interpretation? I don't know. I think the Bible leaves it indeterminate. Okay? In fact, the word day has several different meanings in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Right. In Genesis 2:4, the word day corresponds to the entire 6-day creation period. And the 7th day we're still in. We're still in the 7th day according to Hebrews 4. If the 7th day is longer than 24 hours, maybe the other days are longer too. It looks like Genesis to me is a polemic against the Egyptian creation story.
Okay.
And there's a great book on this that gets into this a little bit. It's by Dan Kimball. It's called How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. Check it out because there's a whole chapter on this where he talks about the Egyptian creation story and how the Hebrew creation story was really a polemic against that story. And that would make sense because they just came out of Egypt, right? They're not walking through the desert going, I wonder how old this place is. That's not their question. Their question is, who is the true God? Is it the Egyptian gods or is Yahweh the true God?
If there's Nephilim, could it be possible that the dinosaur bones might have come from Nephilim, unearthed them? I don't...
No, because Tyrannosaurus rex does not look like a human being.
Right.
Yeah, no,
Say,
there
could it
were
be possible?
dinosaurs. Do you have some issue with believing there were dinosaurs millions of years old?
No,
Okay.
no.
All right.
I'm just arguing, like, if somebody has that argument,
okay.
what would you say to them?
I would say the best evidence is the universe is old, and dinosaurs existed long before man arrived. Now, is this an issue of salvation? No. You want to believe that dinosaurs existed with human beings? You can. I just think the evidence is better the other way. All right?
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is Kevin Spears.
Say again?
Kevin Spears.
Kevin, go ahead, sir.
Okay, so my question is, I got 2. Well, the first one was a question, the second one a statement. Do you have any tips or how do you consistently present the gospel to family or friends who aren't quite walking with Christ or lukewarm Christians?
Yeah, family is the hardest because they already know you.
Mm-hmm.
They already know me. They already know that we're not perfect and we have our flaws. And how's this kid going to tell me what's true? You know, that whole thing. I think asking the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Or you might want to change that question and say, if Jesus really rose from the dead, would you follow him? And see what they say. Just ask the question. And all you can do, if they say no or they hesitate, is just plant seeds, love them, and then wait. And pray, obviously. But then wait.
Yes, sir.
Right?
And then my statement is, I appreciate you a lot. You kind of kicked off my whole journey of coming from not Christian, lukewarm, to being fully Christian about 2 or 3 years back. So I want to say this is an awesome getting to talk
thank
to
you, Kevin. Thanks
I really
for coming
do
out,
appreciate
brother. I appreciate it. Thank you. Hang on, I just got to sign one more right here. Sorry, man, I know you got to go. You can't stay till 6 a.m. Thanks, brother. God bless. Thank you. Yes,
Hey,
sir.
my name is Jonathan.
Jonathan, go ahead, sir.
My question kind of complements his. I have a friend who is Muslim.
Yeah.
So what are some tips that you have in staying consistent in presenting the gospel? Because for that faith, it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah,
to
definitely.
reach.
Well, maybe you could agree that, hey, we all agree there's a God, right? That's good. So we don't have to go through all the arguments for God, right? We already agree on that. The only question is what happened to Jesus. Now, one of the best online resources for this is to go to David Wood's YouTube channel, Acts Apologetics, or Acts 17 Apologetics. I don't know if you've heard of David Wood, but he's made quite a ministry toward Muslims. And what I want you to do is when you go there, on his YouTube channel, type in the Quranic dilemma. The Quranic dilemma. Here's a dilemma you can give to Muslims. And he explains it in this 7-minute animated video. I'll just give you a little piece of it. Where if you look at, say, Surah, which is a chapter in the Quran, Surah 5, verse 68, it says, O ye people of the book. People of the book meaning Christians and the Jews. O ye people of the book, you have no ground to stand on unless you stand on the law and the prophets and the Gospels. In other words, the Quran is telling Jews and Christians to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay? Well, if the Quran is telling Christians and Jews to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament, the problem is the Old Testament and the New Testament later disagrees with the Quran elsewhere. When I mean later, elsewhere in the Quran. Because in the Quran, actually it's the chapter before, in chapter 4, verse 157, Surah 4, verse 157, it says that Jesus didn't even die. He was taken straight to heaven. He wasn't even crucified. The only people that we know about that deny Jesus was crucified are Muslims. Atheists don't deny Jesus was crucified. Even Bart Ehrman, the famous skeptic, says, oh, if there's one event from the ancient world we know took place was the crucifixion of Jesus. Jews don't deny Jesus was crucified. They all admit it. Christians, of course, agree Jesus was crucified. The only people that say he wasn't are working off a text that came 600 years after the events of the New Testament, the eyewitnesses who were there. So I would ask a Muslim, why is the Quran telling the Christians and Jews to obey their scriptures when the scriptures disagree with the Quran elsewhere? Either way, the Quran is not the Word of God. Why? Because if the Quran is telling Christians and Jews to obey the Old and New Testaments, and the Old and New Testaments are true, then the Quran isn't true, where it disagrees with the Old and New Testaments. If the Quran is telling Christians and Jews to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Old Testament and New Testament are not true, then the Quran isn't the Word of God either. Yeah. Do you see? Because it's giving false information. So either way, this is called the Quranic dilemma. So I would just ask them, what do you do with Surah 568? And there are other verses in the Quran. So why would I take a document written 600 years after the events to tell me what happened when we have eyewitnesses writing down what happened 600 years prior to that? And of course, there are other things you want to be aware of with Muslims, and that is you want to emphasize God's love. You want to emphasize God's forgiveness, because this is not part of Islam. You want to emphasize also that you can know that you're saved by trusting in Christ. Muslims don't know if they're going to be saved because all is arbitrary. They don't know if their good deeds are going to outweigh their bad. The only way they can know it is if they die in jihad as a martyr. Other than that, it's questionable. So you want to emphasize these things, and you also want to do this privately because they're not going to want to lose face in front of their friends over this. No one does, not just Muslims, right? This is a private thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jonathan. All right, yes, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Turek.
Yes, sir.
My name is Steve.
Hey, Steve.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
My question is, as Christians, how do we fight and win all the cultural and other influences in our everyday life that sometimes weakens or tests our faith?
Say the first part of it again. How do we what?
As Christians, how do we fight and win all the cultural and other influences in our everyday life that sometimes weakens or tests our faith?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is renew our mind, as Paul said in Romans chapter 12, because how much of the culture is changing us rather than us changing the culture? That's one thing we have to renew our minds on. And I think just a good knowledge of the fact that so much of what goes on in the culture, what's going on in the culture is using terms that are Christian terms, but they're pouring different meanings into the terms, like equality. Who can be against equality? But they don't mean equality like Christianity means equality. They mean equality that all behaviors are equal, right? All behaviors aren't equal. If all behaviors were equal, we wouldn't have any criminal law, right? All behaviors aren't equal. And when they mean equality, they often mean equity. That means everybody has the same amount, okay? Well, Jesus doesn't even believe in equity. Why? What does he do in the parable of the talents? He takes from the guy who had 1 and he gives it to the guy who made 10. Because that guy didn't do anything with his talent. He doesn't believe in equity. He believes in justice. All right? So words like equality and equity are being redefined. Tolerance, as you know, is being redefined. Love is being redefined. Now love means approval. Love doesn't mean approval. In fact, we had a debate a couple of years ago. Myself and Dr. Michael Brown were debating 2 colleagues from the LGBT community. They both claim to be Christians. The title of the debate was, does love require approval, or does love require affirmation, something like that. And at one point in the debate, I turned to our debate opponents and I said, do you love us? And they said yes. And I said, do you approve of our position? They said no. I said, well, you just lost the debate. Because that's our position. We can love you and not approve of your position. You're claiming in order for us to love you, we have to approve of your position. But you don't approve of our position. So you just said you loved us and you don't approve of our position. So it's contradictory. Love does not require approval. Love requires that you seek what's best for the other person, which means you don't approve of evil they want to do because you love them. And every parent knows this, as we mentioned earlier. So another thing I think we need to keep in mind, it's not our job to win political battles. It's our job to be faithful and leave the results to God. I'm not saying don't get involved in politics. 2 of my 5 books are on politics. I'm simply saying don't think that it's your job to win, because you can't control the result anyway. All you can do is be faithful and leave the results to God. That's true of anything. Just be faithful, leave the results to God. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
I forgot to say thank you very much for your service.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Steve. Yes, sir.
Hello. I'm Brett.
Hey, Brett. Go ahead.
So how do I know Luke made Luke, John made John, Matthew made Matthew, and Mark made Matthew? How do I know?
How do we know who the authors of the New Testament documents are? Because the best evidence we have from antiquity is they are the writers of those documents. And even if they aren't, we know that there are, and I'm looking for a slide here, we know that they were certainly written by Jews in the 1st century. Like, for example, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, hang on a sec, let me see if I have this here. Who wrote the Gospels? Take a look at this. The best evidence we have regarding the Gospels is that these early church fathers right here, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, this fragment that was written in about 170 AD, Justin Martyr, and Papias, all of these people confirm that the writers that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote those documents. Secondly, there's only one human link separating John from Irenaeus. That's Polycarp. So this is very close to John. Claims are from every quarter of the Roman Empire that these were the writers of these documents. There's no rival claims about authorship, and they're unlikely invention, these names. Like Luke is not a big name, right? He's not even an eyewitness. Why wouldn't you say, or Mark isn't even a big name. Why wouldn't you say it's the Gospel of Peter rather than the Gospel of Mark? I mean, if you want to get people to believe something that isn't true, you would say Peter wrote the Gospel, not Mark. In fact, there's a Gospel written 100 years after Peter was dead called the Gospel of Peter. And we know it wasn't written by Peter, but somebody put Peter's name on it to get the New Testament believers to try and think it was a true document from Peter. But we know it's written 100 years after he's dead. So It's not a very likely invention to name a gospel after Mark, who's a minor character in the book of Acts. It doesn't make any sense when you could say Peter wrote it, right? Also, there are no documents that have ever been discovered, I should say no manuscripts ever discovered, where we have the title page that didn't say this is the gospel according to Matthew, this is the gospel according to Luke, this is the gospel according to John or Mark. So the idea that these were all anonymous is really mythological. They're not anonymous. This is the best evidence that we have that these gentlemen wrote these documents. Does that make sense?
Can I take a picture?
Sure, go ahead, man. Go ahead, try. Wait, it's gone. No, go ahead. It's all a big conspiracy. It's a conspiracy. It's gone. No, there it is. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you. God bless. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Turek. I'm Costa, and my question is, I was raised Greek Orthodox my whole life.
Yes.
And why do you think traditional religions praise saints so much?
Why do you think they what so much?
Praise saints.
Pray to saints. Yeah, that's a great question. Because I know the Greek Orthodox tradition prays to saints, and so does the Roman Catholic tradition, pray to saints. And I was brought up Roman Catholic because I'm from New Jersey and it's the law. I don't know where that originated from, to tell you the truth. My co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote a book called Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, Agreements and Differences. And I can't remember the section about the saints, how this originated. But it did originate somewhere. I will say this, though. I was once on a trip with a Roman Catholic priest. We went to Medjugorje. You've probably heard of Medjugorje. That's where apparently the Virgin Mary appears or has appeared. Back in the 90s we went. And I asked the Roman Catholic priest with us, I said, you know, 1 Peter 2:15, or is it 3:15? I can't remember where. I think it's 3:15. It says, maybe it's 2. Anyway, the passage says, there's one mediator between God and man, the Lord Christ Jesus. And so I asked him, I said, what do you do with this? You guys are praying to saints. But the Bible itself says there's only one mediator. You go right to Jesus. And he looked at the verse and he went, now, maybe there's a better response than this from the Catholic side. Maybe there is, I don't know. But I don't understand why many people are praying to saints when Jesus is the mediator. There's only one mediator between God and man. By the way, let me say one other thing about this, because I think this is an interesting insight. It's not mine, but I've heard it. That Roman Catholics and Protestants have a disagreement, and I suppose maybe the Greek Orthodox, we might say Greek Orthodox, they have more of a priest sort of viewpoint than the Protestants, right?
They do.
That there are priests, and you got to go through the priest to get to God.
Mm-hmm.
And the Protestants say, no, we don't need priests. We're all equal. We're all laity. And I think the true point is both of these viewpoints are wrong. Why? You don't do away with the priesthood. You do away with the laity. There's nobody who is laity. Everybody's a priest. We go directly to the mediator ourselves. So we're a royal priesthood, as Peter says. So there's no bifurcation between priest and laity. Everyone's a priest if you're a Christian.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Am I signing this? Is this for somebody? Okay. And you got to go. You can't stay much longer, right? I don't have a pen, so. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Michael.
Hey, Michael.
Just real quick. My question is, do you think the fallen angels could have been what many ancient cultures worshipped as gods?
What fallen angels do you mean?
Spoken of in the Old Testament. Third of angels falling from the heavens.
Give me an example of a fallen angel from the Old Testament. You mean Lucifer?
There was a third of angels that followed along with him.
Oh, okay. Well, there is this that Michael Heiser points out in his book, The Unseen Realm. And a simpler version of that book is called Supernatural, both by Michael Heiser, where he says God is a divine council. And this divine council is spoken of, I want to say it's Psalm 89, maybe Psalm 82 as well, a couple other places. And this divine council, of course, God doesn't need a divine council. He doesn't need any of us. but he set up these spiritual beings who were Elohim. They were called gods, but they're not the God, right? They're created beings. And he assigned them to the different nations. And when they turned those nations against Yahweh, God confused their languages, this is the Tower of Babel, and disinherited the nations. And in the very next chapter, Abraham shows up. And this is God now going to re-inherit those nations through a process through Abraham. So for me, whenever I read the Tower of Babel, I said, this is a bizarre story. What is this about confusing the languages? It doesn't seem to make any sense. But once you see that there's a divine council who God says, you are going to die like men now, these Elohim, because of what you've done. Now I'm going to reacquire the nations. You see, well, it should be this way from your perspective. Here's the Tower of Babel. God disinherits the nations. He brings forth a Messiah that comes from Abraham all the way through David, and Jesus arises, and he's the Messiah, the seed, who saves the world. And then right after that, you have Pentecost. Pentecost is the reversal of Babel. God confuses the languages in Babel. He has people speak different languages so they could communicate with one another. In Pentecost, here is where he begins to re-inherit the nations. Notice when Jesus gives the Great Commission, he goes, therefore, make disciples of all people. No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? Make disciples of all nations. He's re-inheriting the nations. And that re-inheriting continues to this very day. You're all part of it. So there were these, you want to call them fallen angels, you want to call them Elohim that fell away. You might say they were part of the divine council, if you want to say that. Okay. And they led people astray. And God now has put a plan in place to re-inherit the nations, and that's what he's doing now.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. All right. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Austin.
Austin. Good name. My
Thank
third
you.
son named Austin.
Oh, great. Question goes on with something someone else asked earlier. Do you think God used what some people would call evolution as a vessel for creation? So to simplify that, to say that possibly Adam and Eve were Neanderthals or some sort of cavemen per se, or that we evolved from stardust to a tadpole to so on and so forth?
Right. Well, I don't think macroevolution is true on the merits. In other words, independent of what the Bible says, I don't think there's good evidence that macroevolution is true. I think there's good evidence that microevolution is true, adaptation within a type. I mean, if we all came from Adam and Eve, there's a lot of variation amongst us, right? That's adaptation within a type. But I don't think macroevolution from the goo to you via the zoo without intelligence is true for a number of reasons. I don't have time to get all the details here, but I'll just say some of them, and they're in our book, Stealing from God. The fossil record does not agree with this. We should have transitional forms all over the place. We don't have it. We have the major phyla coming up in the Cambrian explosion, most of the major phyla fully formed. Irreducible complexity does not allow creatures to be modified gradually and still have function. Epigenetic information is not DNA, but it's the structure of the cell that you can't modify through DNA. And if you're going to get a new body plan, you need new structure, and you can't get that by mutating DNA. That's why there are even evolutionists now saying we need a new theory of macroevolution, because mutating DNA will never give you a new body plan. You also have the fact that there's genetic limits of change that we can't even break as intelligent breeders, right? We have people trying to breed dogs, and all they can get are different kinds of dogs. They can't break the genus of dogs using their intelligence. Why would we expect a non-intelligent process to do this? And I might add one other thing. Even if macroevolutionary theory were true, you wouldn't get rid of the need for God. Why? Because the very laws that drive it are still goal-directed. You still need the natural laws. Where do laws come from? They come from a lawgiver to do all this. So I don't think there's good evidence for macroevolution, and even if there was, it wouldn't defeat Christianity.
Okay. Thank you, sir. God bless.
Yes, sir. The Ohio State University. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Victor.
Victor.
First, I just want to thank you for this awesome presentation, although now I have to be careful using the word awesome for everything.
Don't use that here.
So
that's right.
This is great. incredible presentation.
Well, thanks, brother.
But I'm actually a campus minister at Ohio State, and I find when I do Bible studies with a lot of the kids over there, especially amongst, coming from different religions or backgrounds, there's always confusion about the big questions like salvation and the point of when someone is saved. And so my question is, would you ever do like series or teach lectures on biblical conversion?
Well, right now we're going through the book of Galatians on our TV show. In fact, last night we were filming one of the lessons. We were in Galatians 3, and we were filming it. We were streaming it on YouTube. So yeah, we go through Bible books sometimes on our TV show. But what kind of question are you looking to ask here with regard to salvation? What's the angle you're coming at it from?
Really no angle. I was just wanting to say I wanted to ask a question and figured, just found the question. But
well, how are people saved? They're saved by accepting the free gift of salvation that Christ has provided. He's our substitute, right? He takes our punishment on himself. So you're not only forgiven for what you've done, you're given his righteousness.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, when is the point of salvation?
Oh, when is the point of salvation? When you have repented and accepted what Christ has done. That's going to be different for different people, right? And that's an instantaneous thing. That happens immediately. Sanctification is a longer process, done by the same means through faith, not by observing the law, not by relying on the law. But justification happens immediately. Sanctification is a lifelong process. In fact, you can look at it this way. It took a day to get Israel out of Egypt. That's justification. It took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. That's sanctification. So long process.
So I guess I would ask now, I agree, repentance is a decision, which is immediate. But in Acts 2:38, when Peter says repent and be baptized, what is the purpose of baptism?
Baptism is a sign that you are saved. It's the only place where Peter says it. And who's he talking to when he says this? He's talking to people who literally crucified Christ. You need to repent and be baptized for the remission of your sins. He's not saying that baptism is necessary for salvation, but it's the necessary, if you're being obedient, follow on to salvation. You are going to preach to the world or let the world know that you are saved, that you're buried with Christ and raised to new life. But we know that water baptism doesn't save you. I know Christians argue over this, but I think it's pretty airtight to say why it doesn't. Why? Because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, I don't even remember who I baptized. He said, I didn't come to baptize. I came to preach the gospel. And in Romans 1, he says the gospel saves. So notice, he's leaving the baptism outside of the gospel, and he says the gospel saves. So it's the gospel that saves you. It's not any rite or ritual that you perform after you've accepted the free gift. That's just a sign of you that you've accepted the free gift. That's what baptism is. And of course, the thief on the cross wasn't baptized either.
Yeah, well, I guess would Peter contradict that when he said in 1 Peter 3, this baptism now saves you?
Okay, 1 Peter 3 is a notoriously difficult passage. That's when he goes and preaches to the souls in hell, I think. Okay, so we'd have to exegete that passage. We don't have time to do it now, and I'm really tired.
Yeah.
But if you want a good book on these kind of things, get the book, Big Book of Bible Difficulties by Norman Geisler. Geisler and Howe, H-O-W-E. Geisler is the guy who wrote I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with, and that book goes into many of these issues. Also, there's another book that he and Ron Rhodes wrote called, I think it's called When Cultists Ask. When Cultists Ask. And it goes through some of these theological questions that people have. You can also go to websites like Watchman.
Hey, Dylan, that's right. So this objection happened when I was talking to a buddy of mine about the resurrection. So essentially, atheists often have and tried and failed to explain away the resurrection with natural causes. I'm curious if anyone has tried an alternative supernatural cause to the resurrection. My buddy tried mentioning off a bunch of different things that could have been almost like a supernatural imposter, i.e., Jesus not being who he was. I said, what evidence do you have? And he said, that. So obviously, from speculation levels, well, I think there could be a billion reasons for that. I'm just curious if a scholar or an apologetic scholar has countered such a claim before.
There was someone a number of years ago that came out with the theory that Jesus had an identical twin brother.
Yeah.
And that's who resurrected. You know, he hadn't really resurrected. He just walked around and said, I'm God and all this. You know, I was dead, but I'm alive. That doesn't solve the problem either. Why? Well, you still got the empty tomb. Why is the tomb empty? Why did the Romans and Jews take the body out? So his twin brother can do miracles after the fact too? I mean, he can, you know, Jesus did miracles over 40 days, it says in the scripture there. And nobody saw this twin brother until Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead. And is there any evidence he had a twin brother? No. I mean, look, there's a difference between a possibility and evidence for a possibility.
Right.
Okay? You can come up with any theory you want, but it's just a theory.
Like Jesus being from an alien civilization coming down.
Yeah,
is what I've heard.
You can come up with any theory you want, but do you have any evidence for it is the question.
Right, that's what I said.
You can believe anything you want, but is it reasonable? You have no evidence for it? Probably not.
Right.
Right. You can say anything you want. You might say, if it really did look like the real Jesus died and rose again, would you become a Christian?
Right.
What's he going to say? What do you think he would say?
He said no, but he's
Well,
coming from
you're
like
wasting your time, man.
Right, yeah. He's got a lot of Mormon baggage, so
Yeah.
kind of
What kind of baggage?
He grew up in like the Mormon church, and so he's kind of walked away from that for obvious reasons.
I understand why, because if you walked away, if you thought you've been duped already, you don't want to get duped again.
Absolutely.
But what people don't realize is that even atheism is a different kind of belief system.
Right.
There are positive beliefs for atheism, right?
Absolutely.
Like, how did the universe get here? Well, I don't know, quantum fluctuation, or, you know, how did we get here? Some kind of evolution, you know. They have positive beliefs they believe in. Oh, materialism is where he pointed out materialism doesn't explain how you can even think. It would seem to nullify that. So, everybody has some sort of belief system. The question is, does your belief system have good evidence for it? And does it explain what needs to be explained? Does it have sufficient explanatory power and scope to answer the big questions in life?
Right. Okay, cool.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dylan. Yes, sir.
Dr. Frank, I'm Andy.
Andy, go ahead, sir.
Two questions that are related. One a little quicker, one may take a little longer to unpack for you. The first one is, there's been a subtle change in the new atheists and the new pushback from agnostics and atheists, that the tweak has been God, not so much God doesn't exist, but God isn't good.
Okay.
And that's a biggie for people that are studying and wanting to do evangelism. So the first question is, how are the professionals dealing with that? Because that's a small tweak that's become a big thing, particularly for lay folks that are trying to navigate that.
Well, it presupposes a standard. So my question is going to be, what do you mean by good? Right? Where are you getting this standard of good? Explain what you mean by good. What is good? And is your definition of good the definition of good, or is it just your definition of good? If it's just your definition of good, then it's not to be imposed on anybody else. Why should we believe your definition?
Why do you
is
think
right?
that trend has happened? Because that used to be God doesn't exist and they'd come up with their arguments.
Right.
But now that's switched towards God is not good.
Well, you need a standard. And really, this is, I think, the reason a lot of people stay out of Christianity, because they're on a happiness quest. They're not on a truth quest. And they think that the things that the biblical God wants you to do and doesn't want you to do is going to interfere with their happiness.
The other related question, that's very good. The other related question is, your friend, J. Warner Wallace, coined the $1 apologist.
Yes.
And so many of us here are the $1 apologists. Right. How important right now at this time, this moment in time, in the modern church, battling what we are battling, is the $1 apologist in the local church. And in your estimation, what should we be doing in the local church with apologetics?
Not at all. Jim doesn't know what he's talking about. No. Jim's spot on. Everybody, it's just like we were talking before, Andy, that, you know, everybody's a priest. Everybody should be an apologist. Doesn't mean everyone's going to be equally knowledgeable, right? People have different gifts and different interests and different abilities. But everybody should know why we believe what we believe. First of all, reason demands it, and the Bible commands it, right? The Bible says you ought to have answers. You ought to have reasons for what you believe. Doesn't mean you're all going to be William Lane Craig or Josh McDowell or somebody, but you should get answers to the basic questions people are asking. And if you don't know what those answers are, you should at least know where to get them. And our young people, by the way, they come to places like The Ohio State University, and they don't get evidence for Christianity. They get a lot of skepticism against Christianity. And what we do as parents is we send them into a war unarmed. And then we wonder why they come out of this institution, which may teach some very fine things, but they come out of this institution as skeptics and doubters. And we've just paid $100 grand for that to happen.
What do you believe, why is the modern church and good churches, why does apologetics seem to be the nerds, the special forces, or the redheaded stepchildren? Why isn't the church, they can see the cancer in the culture, they can see the need to have answers, whether it be youth or adults or people searching. Why is apologetics not thriving with all the apologetics materials that are out there?
Well, it's doing better than it was. I think one of the reasons is it's much easier to say, look, I just have faith. It's my thing. You have your thing. Right? I mean, people are tired. People have Netflix binges to go on, right? You can't study all this stuff all the time. There's too many other things to watch and do, right? So, no, seriously, it's because the church went anti-intellectual 100 years ago, and they didn't think they could answer Darwinism, so instead of engaging the culture, they separated from the culture. They got out of the culture, and when the godly people get out of the culture, when they get out of law and politics and education and these kind of things, it's no wonder the people who are not godly take over, and they impose their own moral viewpoints on the rest of the country. And that's why we are where we are now. It's not the liberals' fault or the leftists' fault that our country is where it is. It's the Christians' fault, because the Christians haven't been salt and light so long. It's our fault. We should be the ones who are teaching the truth and showing reasons why Christianity is true. I mean, throughout history, ever since the Apostle Paul, Christians have been in the lead in creating universities, for example. I mean, those occurred much later, but they were all Christians that started all these universities. There were Christians that had systematic thought. The queen of all sciences was and still remains theology, because it puts all of your knowledge under one umbrella of God's truth. So it's really our fault that we've gotten away from that, because we're too concerned about our best life now. All right? So... all right, folks, I wish you could stay longer, but I can't. So, and thanks to everybody out there. Next week, by the way, next week we're going to be at the University of Utah on Monday night and Boise State University on Tuesday night. So tune in for that. And also go to HollywoodHeroesBook.com.